The tale commences with a disinterested fiend lounging atop his grand seat of authority. His designation? Kim Jang-kol, once nothing more than a typical postgraduate scholar residing in South Korea. Or at least that's who he used to be. Merely a day prior, he underwent a bewildering transformation, now embodying Kratos, the sovereign of demons and ultimate adversary in the digital universe of his cherished game. A narrative trope indeed. Jang-kol then proceeded to outline the mechanics of the game, Paladin of Blood. Allegedly, his objective was to reawaken the primeval champion who had succumbed to a prolonged torpor. However, he promptly halted his own explanation. After all, relaying that to the invisible observers felt futile. More pressing dilemmas now demanded his attention. Mere moments passed before a man stepped into the fortress halls and formally addressed him by his new title, Lord Kratos. This infernal being, Zephyros, served as a level 15 adjutant. He announced that the mobilization for war had been finalized. Monstrosities lingered outside, eager to descend into battle. One in particular exhibited boundless enthusiasm. Level 534 entity Azurat, famously dubbed the Bloodthirsty Prince. His intent was to quell their hunger through the spoils of the day's conquest. Alongside him stood the frigid sovereign Sergi, marked at level 531, who bore the sorrow of having been born into desolation, having endured the grotesque fate of consuming her kin. Her ambition, to forge an enduring legend. Then came the Fog Archduke Hartok, listed at level 555, and the Ebony Boulder Overlord Ball, reaching level 539. These monstrous beings had already descended into unruly fervor, barely restraining themselves while awaiting the monarch's decree. Eventually, the protagonist lifted his voice to capture the attention of the infernal battalion. Demon Army, listen up. The quartet of top commanders loomed, regal and menacing. From this point forward, I, Kratos, order all demon folk. As he began to articulate his command, smoke billowed from his maw. The four ravenous warlords grew restless, their anticipation bordering on madness, yearning for orders of bloodshed. But then, with unwavering resolution and a gaze that could unnerve the heavens, Lord Kratos proclaimed that hostilities must cease, and instead, they would commence agriculture, start farming. Utter stupefaction seized the crowd. Disbelief erupted into uproar. Bedlam followed, naturally paired with feral outrage. Lord Kratos remained undeterred, persistently bellowing his new directive. Yet within the recesses of Jang-kol's consciousness, there was only one thought. They were absolutely terrifying. The notorious top four of the demon realm stood with jaws slack, speechless. Whether it was intimidation by his unfortunate countenance or sheer shock at the absurdity of the proclamation, it was hard to say. Regardless, Jang-kol was well aware of the ramifications that an actual war would bring within the game's mechanics. Elsewhere, in a distant location, someone appeared to be emerging from an unknown structure or dimension. Simultaneously, an alert from the game's interface surfaced, stating that the participant was embarking on his 20th iteration. A celestial beam illuminated the figure. That individual? A player with a staggering level of 9,990, identified as Aged Kim Chi, a name that haunted Kratos as he was convinced this would be the one to end him. Strangely, there also seemed to be the odd implication that this formidable player might be clad in a gown. But before plunging into the imminent chaos, the narrative takes a step back, to the existence of our protagonist prior to being ensnared in the game's reality. During his mundane existence, Kim Jang-kol had been an agronomy postgraduate, his greatest aspiration being to ascend as a fabulously affluent agriculturist. By his own account, he considered himself a prodigy, having effortlessly sailed through his curriculum with top marks. So distinguished was his academic performance that even his instructor lauded him, going so far as to commission him to draft a thesis on his behalf. Of course, under the polite guise that it would greatly benefit Jang-kol's own scholarly advancement. Someone else requested his assistance on a separate endeavor, while another individual commanded him to till the soil. In the end, Yang Chul had essentially become the top-tier laborer. When fatigue finally overwhelmed him, he began to question the path his existence had taken. All the burden had fallen on his shoulders, while the professors reaped all the accolades. In frustration, he screamed his desire to eliminate all those insufferable individuals. His dopamine reserves were depleted, and he was spiraling into madness. The only relief, the only way to replenish his dopamine surge, was through immersive gaming. A specific title captured his obsession, one notoriously punishing and excruciatingly slow to progress within. No participant had ever completed the game's 19th cycle. Desperate for a sense of fulfillment, He began playing obsessively, foregoing rest entirely. He played through the first round, then the second, and continued relentlessly until he reached the 10th loop. Eventually, he became the inaugural player to conquer Paladin of Blood for the 19th consecutive time. The triumph of being crowned the mightiest in the realm brought him joy, though his appearance betrayed severe exhaustion. He anticipated the 20th cycle would be unbearably nightmarish. Before diving in, he needed to increase his stats. Spiraling, he kept muttering that he would grind levels endlessly and that he was the supreme force. His avatar had reached level 9,990, equipped with the most quintessential warrior gear imaginable. Given that the ceiling was level 9,999, he resolved to halt the grind there. It had taken him countless years to reach this pinnacle, and now the 20th campaign was about to commence. As he clicked the confirmation button, the screen burst into radiant brilliance. Puzzled, he questioned the phenomenon. His essence was being drawn into the display, it was pulled directly into the television. A flash lit the heavens. His soul accelerated at incomprehensible velocity. Although his physical form remained motionless, internally he was seized by panic. He urged himself to stay composed and apply his intellect. Observing that his form was now a cool blue hue, he deduced that he existed in spiritual form. He reasoned that upon descent he would not perish. Then, as he caught sight of the Tower of Life, a realization dawned: he had entered the game world. The name echoed in his thoughts, Paladin of Blood. He was stunned to find himself before the tomb of the Paladin. Elation overtook him at the thought of inhabiting his in-game persona, aged Kimchi, who was practically maxed out in level. He declared that his era of invincibility and overwhelming strength was about to commence. But as his gaze fell upon his character, resting in slumber, the mood shifted. His digital avatar was a muscular blonde man dressed in an enchanted girl ensemble, wielding a wand shaped like a winged heart. Upon witnessing this scene, a wave of realization crashed over him. He had no desire to morph into that. His soul veered off course. He had no clue where it was headed now. Then his vision settled on the Demon King, poised atop a throne. That too was not his intention. But in the present instant, he found himself occupying the form of the Demon Overlord. He muttered that the situation was driving him insane. His expression twisted with unease as he lamented the moment of idiocy. If only he hadn't entertained that foolish thought upon seeing aged Kimchi, he could have become the most dominant figure in the realm. Now all he felt was regret and foolishness. His attendant advanced down the corridor. Zephyros perceived whispers echoing from within, rumors that Kratos had undeniably diminished in strength. His gaze turned toward the entrance, trying to pinpoint the origin of the murmurs. The voices grew clearer, it was the general speaking. Azurat proposed an alliance to sever Kratos' head and subsequently divide the dominion of the throne among themselves. He justified this mutiny by recalling how Kratos had seized the crown by decapitating the prior demon sovereign. However, Azurat briefly entertained the notion that perhaps Kratos hadn't weakened at all. If that were the reality, any two of the four attempting to overthrow him would likely suffer grave wounds or perish entirely. Sergi responded by suggesting that if Azurat volunteered to act as their shield, they might stand a chance. Annoyed, Azurat retorted with a warning: she could fall to his hand before the plan even began. Meanwhile, Baal voiced no preference. His thoughts revolved solely around his appetite. Azurat challenged the group further, questioning what they would do if definitive proof emerged that the Demon Lord's power had waned. 3 of them responded without hesitation: if it were true, they would eliminate him. Baal once again remained indifferent. Hunger was his only concern. Outside the chamber, Zephyros remained stationed by the doorway. He relayed troubling information to Kratos. Morale within their forces had plummeted entirely. He elaborated that incidents of infighting and cannibalistic behavior among the ranks had escalated. Others had deserted the demon territory altogether without any declaration. Furthermore, he informed Kratos that the 4 supreme demon generals were livid. Word had spread that he had lost his strength, and a coordinated coup was forming to claim his head. This revelation caused Kratos to shiver. He understood the stakes. Should the 4 generals converge upon him, survival was implausible. In short, displaying any semblance of fragility meant certain death. His mind drifted to aged Kimchi. Since he hadn't merged with that form, he pondered whether the character remained inert, an abandoned corpse. The thought crossed his mind that perhaps an invasion into the human domain would have been the superior choice. Zephyros then unveiled a recording dispatched by General Ogmia. The footage featured the tomb of the Paladin. Within the video, aged Kimchi was depicted slaying demons without mercy. One demon in particular appeared terrified, pleading desperately for assistance. Agonizing shrieks filled the air as his eyes were savagely torn from their sockets. Aged Kimchi emanated the aura of a remorseless executioner. Upon witnessing this, Kratos acknowledged that launching an assault on humanity was futile. The way Kimchi operated resembled a deranged killer. Kratos felt resolute. He had no intention of ever encountering him. He would remain entrenched in that location regardless of the cost. Under such conditions he saw only two possible outcomes: appear diminished and be executed by the generals, or enter the human realm and be brutally slain by Kimchi. Either way doom awaited. Despair weighed heavily on him, and he internally lamented his transference to this accursed world. He expressed that even fleeting happiness seemed unattainable. One option remained: stabilize the food crisis and pacify the demon population. Zephyros then inquired about his next destination. Kratos first mumbled an apology, then responded that he intended to survey agricultural lands. Zephyros recoiled, visibly disturbed by the apology. Kratos questioned his reaction. Zephyros elaborated: Kratos was egocentric, conceited, and utterly devoid of etiquette. To hear him say pardon was nauseating and downright disturbing. He urged him never to repeat such behavior. Internally, Kratos was puzzled by Zephyros' attitude. He wondered if perhaps his subordinate was deliberately trying to provoke him. He couldn't tell if Zephyros was simply committed to playing some elaborate role. Zephyros had made only a single appearance, just before the confrontation with the demon sovereign, without any context or background, and that brief emergence ironically contributed to his popularity. At the time, his words were a plea to the revered paladin, informing him that the monarch of darkness no longer wished to engage in combat. Aged Kimchi attacked him anyway. Following that, Zephyros expressed regret for his inability to safeguard his liege, which led players to perceive him as either deeply devoted to the Demon King or someone who held immense admiration for him. Now, Zephyros informed Kratos that his latest failure was unlike any previously seen. Never before had he encountered a Dark Lord who had forfeited so much faith among their own kind. To Kratos, Zephyros was insufferably irritating. The attendant then pulled out a journal and remarked on his intent to cultivate in demonic territory, likening his memory to that of pigeons, fleeting and poor. Kratos reminded him of his own authority as sovereign, warning him not to press further, yet Zephyros persisted unabated. This left Kratos pondering why his subordinate displayed no signs of intimidation. Zephyros elaborated that past demon kings, including Kratos himself, had attempted agriculture in that same wasteland. The brutal and extreme fluctuations in climate rendered the land barren, unfit for crops. Kratos conceded internally. He knew it was desolate terrain, but remained assured that his current strength could bring salvation to it. In truth, farming was a task he loathed, but survival demanded it. Zephyros watched in bewilderment as Kratos began tilling the soil. The sight became comedic when the Demon King inadvertently ingested the dirt. Zephyros remarked that the Dark Lord had now become a destitute figure who consumed soil. He documented the observation in his notes. When Kratos instructed him to cease writing, Zephyros insisted it was merely his duty, asserting that chronicling the ruler's activities was essential. He even scribbled a comment about the apparent decline in Kratos' memory retention. To the Demon King, Zephyros was a persistent nuisance. Upon analysis, Kratos confirmed the soil lacked nutrients. No traces of nitrogen were present. Nitrogen, an element vital to botanical growth, is inaccessible to plants in its atmospheric state due to its molecular structure. Despite comprising 78% of the atmosphere, its tightly bound triple atoms prevent any spontaneous chemical interactions. Humanity had addressed this problem via industrial nitrogen fixation through advanced chemistry, which had sparked a revolution in food supply. Unfortunately, duplicating that process here was unfeasible. There was simply no base substance available to begin cultivation. Then Kratos reflected on a natural solution: lightning. Atmospheric discharges of high voltage oxidize nitrogen into nitrites, which then mix with rainfall and seep into the earth. His method would mirror this natural system. It was time for his signature move. Kratos dragged a claw across his hand, drawing blood, initiating his infamous ability, Bloody Strike. The spell simultaneously unleashed electrical energy and moisture, designed precisely to prepare the soil for sowing. He ordered Zephyros to step aside. The pain was sharp and relentless. Kratos couldn't fathom how the deranged Demon King had managed to use such a technique habitually when it stung so violently. Just as he braced himself for the incantation, he sensed something amiss. His gaze drifted, catching the figures of the four great generals observing from a distance. Their presence was devoid of any lethal pressure, but their expressions were clear. They believed their leader had weakened. This revelation startled Kratos. Zephyros casually stated that the demon lord had diminished by a full 100%. That statement triggered a thought in Kratos. Perhaps Zephyros was no mere aide but a covert executioner, provoking him intentionally before finishing him off. Still, it seemed preferable to an inevitable death. Resolved, he cut his hand again and activated the bloody strike. The result? Nothing. Only blood loss. He winced openly, unable to mask the agony. Then came the generals. One of them stepped closer and inquired if he was feeling unwell. Not a single one of them even bothered projecting any aura of menace. The only thing Kratos could mutter was a curse beneath his breath. Elsewhere, aged Kimchi surveyed the immense landscape before him. Traces of his prior existence lingered in his memory. He had lived through more than a dozen lifetimes and had once been driven by a powerful summons, a call of obligation that guided his steps. But now that directive had vanished, and the once commanding voice had fallen silent. He found himself questioning the very purpose of his continued existence. A somber mood fell over him, his face cast in shadows of doubt. Back with the protagonist, hostile gazes bore down on him like those of predators sizing up prey. Azurat reiterated the fundamental principle among demons. Supremacy defined rulership. The most powerful one reigned as Demon King. Inwardly, Kratos admitted his fear. Each of the generals radiated an overwhelming presence, and he was all too aware of just how terrifyingly formidable they were. At that moment he couldn't even access any of his abilities. A question surged in his thoughts. Was this how he would meet his end? His limbs trembled uncontrollably, and a fierce expression distorted his face. From Azurat's perspective, Kratos was radiating such palpable energy that it seemed he was charging power even before the clash began. Still, Azurat felt sure of himself. He challenged Kratos, questioning his capacity to triumph in such a weakened state. But upon glancing backward, Azurat was stunned to discover the other high-ranking demons had already taken cover behind nearby trees. His confidence wavered. The betrayal was instant. Less than a minute had passed before those traitors abandoned him. Their scheme was to spectate from a safe distance, assessing the battle's outcome and only joining if victory seemed within reach. Beads of sweat gathered on Azurat's brow. He inwardly cursed them as wicked scoundrels, though he quickly reminded himself, they were demons and such treachery was in their very nature. Meanwhile, Zephyros declared that according to the ancient customs of demonkind, combat was always fatal, and surrender was not an option. Just as he prepared to initiate the duel, Azurat interjected, requesting a delay. Kratos was taken aback by how rapidly the rules had been imposed upon him. Azurat silently encouraged himself, trying to maintain courage, convinced he could still prevail, believing that the Demon King had truly diminished. Internally, Kratos spiraled into panic, unsure of what course to take. He had recently tested his strength, expecting immense power from the Demon King's body. While he was indeed strong, it wasn't to the awe-inspiring degree he had anticipated, not enough to boast about. Azurat lunged forward. Kratos recognized the maneuver. It resembled either a stabbing thrust or a slicing strike, moves he had studied from the game. He was certain he wouldn't be able to evade it. Yet his body swerved instinctively. He blinked in surprise, unable to comprehend how he managed to sidestep the attack. Then he noticed a detail. Azurat's left foot angled outward, indicating a thrust. It was a familiar stance, mirroring the exact same motion patterns from the game. Azurat clicked his tongue in frustration as his attack missed its mark. Observing from the sidelines, Hartok asked Sergi if she had caught Kratos' reaction during the dodge. He interpreted it as a signal, a calculated response as though Kratos was preparing to rip Azurat's limb from his body. Sergi questioned why Kratos hadn't taken the opportunity. She advised continuing to watch and assess further. Azurat pressed the offensive once more and again Kratos avoided him. Confusion settled deeper within him. Every movement, every gesture from Azurat, mirrored the gameplay he knew by heart. He recalled the first time he had encountered this foe. He had been utterly overwhelmed. Azurat had incredible speed, feint attacks that disrupted rhythm, and a diverse arsenal of techniques. But after suffering defeat once, thrice, and 10 times, it wasn't until his 128th attempt that Kratos finally overcame him. In the subsequent 19 playthroughs, he had mastered every trick, even achieving flawless victories where he was never touched. Now Azurat lashed out again, but it made no difference. Kratos felt secure. There was no way any of Azurat's strikes could land now. The other generals watched in silence. They took note of his confident expression, and it sent a chill down their spines. Azurat continued to barrage him, but Kratos evaded each attack with fluid precision. They noticed the shift. Kratos was enjoying himself. There was amusement in his eyes as though he was mocking Azurat's weakness. Azurat's frustration grew, while Kratos allowed himself a moment of relief. Even though he could dodge endlessly, he also understood a painful truth. He lacked the strength to finish the battle. Avoidance alone wouldn't lead to victory. Yet, a crucial realization dawned upon him. The realm he had entered operated under the same mechanics as the game he once played. The system acknowledged his comprehension by notifying him that he had grasped a fundamental principle of this world's logic. As he glanced at the interface, he likened it to the narrative pop-ups commonly seen in digital comics. The display indicated that his recent evasive maneuvers, executed with intense focus, had granted him a reward. A portion of the interface typically reserved for user-controlled avatars had now become accessible. A targeting module had been enabled. Kratos stared as a reticle appeared, precisely aligned with Azurat's forehead. He instantly recognized the feature. It was the same mechanic employed when unleashing advanced techniques. Understanding its implication, he scratched his palm once again and activated Bloody Strike. The technique generated an orb that discharged lightning, directly striking Azurat. The remaining generals were taken aback. The watching demons who were observing the duel remotely erupted into celebratory cheers for Kratos. Azurat's attire had been reduced to scorched remnants, and now he was down on his knees, coughing amidst the settling debris. Kratos was astonished that Azurat had survived the Bloody Strike, an ability that, within the game, resulted in immediate death. Concern surged through him. He realized Azurat was already beginning to regenerate, and it would be only a short time before he was fully revitalized. He launched another bolt of lightning at him. He repeated the action relentlessly, delivering wave after wave of electric strikes. The other high-ranking demons began to tremble, disturbed by the sight. Their fear stemmed from Kratos' ruthless onslaught, an assault engineered not to end Azurat's life, but to torment him, ensuring he remained alive through the pain. In truth, Kratos was panicking internally. He had no clear idea how to finish Azurat, whose endurance seemed limitless. The system alerted Kratos with an unexpected message. All of Azurat's clothing had been completely obliterated, and he now stood exposed. The message confused him. It felt absurdly inappropriate, as if the interface had mischaracterized him as some deviant. Another prompt followed. A new functionality had been activated. Equipment removal from the inventory had been enabled. This piqued his interest. He speculated there might be valuable gear available. He accessed the inventory, only to discover that the sole item present was the outfit he currently wore. There was nothing viable for immediate use. Resigned, he resolved to neutralize Azurat first. Despite the demon's regenerative capability, which ensured his return to fighting condition, Kratos knew he needed to act quickly. An idea surfaced. Since Azurat hadn't perished, he remained a valid target. By continuously deploying Bloody Strike, he could saturate the terrain with immense quantities of nitrogen, a strategy that would serve a dual purpose. He privately praised his own ingenuity. He assessed the expressions of the other generals, anticipating fear in their eyes. To confirm their intimidation, he issued a command to Sergi. He instructed her to restrain Azurat securely. Sergi interpreted the directive differently, believing it to be a calculated act to disgrace both herself and Azurat by binding a naked figure in such a degrading fashion. Nonetheless, Azurat was affixed to a cross. That was the initial step, constructing a conduit for the upcoming lightning barrage. Azurat remained unconscious while being positioned. Minutes passed before he stirred and declared his full recovery. He mocked Kratos, stating that his inability to kill with Bloody Strike proved his decline in strength. He vowed to decapitate him. But Kratos had moved on to the second stage. By executing Bloody Strike, he aimed to oxidize atmospheric nitrogen into nitrite. He instructed Hartok to envelop the entire area in thick fog. The haze needed to be so dense that moisture would drip freely. Hartok, interpreting the plan as a means of amplifying the torment, concluded that Kratos was enhancing the lightning's conductivity to increase the pain. He admired the inventiveness of the approach, admitting it was an enlightening experience. He complied, conjuring the mist. This was the third phase, diffusing the fog. The fourth phase followed, strike and repeat. Kratos continued activating Bloody Strike, pushing his limits to the point of personal agony. Zephyros observed with an indifferent expression, unmoved by the spectacle. Meanwhile, the generals stood in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the sheer intensity. Azurat endured repeated blasts over and over again. Kratos found satisfaction in the process, not just for subduing his opponent, but because in doing so he was enriching the soil with nitrogen, rendering it fertile ground for cultivation. He imagined a prosperous yield awaiting him. That single thought filled him with anticipation. He unleashed another strike, continuing the cycle until twilight descended. Eventually the protagonist examined the earth. Satisfaction settled over him. All that remained was to maintain the infusion of nitrogen using the same method. His subsequent objective was to enhance the soil's quality. The current state of the terrain, loose, poorly bonded, with an inconsistent texture, prevented proper oxygen flow and retained excess water. For successful cultivation, a friable, crumb-structured soil was essential. Hence, the next necessary step was to produce fertilizer. He issued a command of utmost importance. He demanded organic waste. The high-ranking demons were staggered. Following the intense punishment inflicted on Azurat, they assumed the command implied smearing him with excrement. To them the idea bordered on savagery. They viewed the directive as unbelievably brutal. Elsewhere, beneath the bright midday sky, aged Kimchi wandered through the forest. A distant plea for aid reached his ears. He made his way toward the source, parting the foliage. There, behind the shrubbery, stood two individuals. They claimed to have been assaulted by goblins and requested assistance, offering compensation in return. For readers acquainted with these two figures, their identities were clear, true legends of the genre. Aged Kimchi's expression remained stern, unsettling the pair. Though he reassured them of his innocence, the men instinctively judged him to be deeply suspicious. He questioned their injuries and, without delay, hoisted the nobleman onto his shoulder like a sack of grain. The other man was instructed to guide them forward. While being carried, the noble remarked on Kimchi's strength. He introduced himself as Ravage Azrahan, with his companion identified as Dayal Frontera, an homage to the iconic characters Lloyd and Javier. When Ravage inquired about Kimchi's identity, the reply was that it remained a mystery yet to be solved. For those unfamiliar with the greatest estate developer, the scene hinted at future coverage of the series. Back at the demon stronghold, the trio of commanders appeared exasperated. Hartok questioned how they were expected to simply produce feces. He sarcastically suggested if they were meant to create it on demand. Sergi shouted in dismay, appalled, revolted, and clearly overwhelmed. She spiraled into panic. Baal admitted he hadn't eaten in a considerable time and thus couldn't contribute. He speculated that Sergi was equally incapable. She snapped at him, refusing to discuss such matters. Hartok, unwilling to donate his own waste, proposed a more aggressive solution, coerced the lower-ranked demons into providing it. Soon after, in a demonic village, a desperate creature pleaded with them not to proceed. The unfortunate soul protested that he couldn't relieve himself while being observed. He begged them to step outside. Another soldier retorted that similar requests had been made before, yet no progress had been achieved. Hartok grew impatient, demanding results. He confirmed with the demon that, despite all effort, there would be no outcome. The creature confessed he hadn't eaten in days. Frustrated, Hartok seized the demon, summoning his power. He thanked the poor thing for the accidental inspiration. He attacked him, eliciting a painful cry. The assault was cut short when Baal intervened, gripping Hartok's wrist. Hartok asked what the interruption was for. Baal clarified that piercing the abdomen would be fatal, eliminating any chance of obtaining the needed material. He explained that the demons must remain alive to yield the waste required. Hartok released the demon and, surprisingly, praised Baal's insight, especially coming from someone like him. Yet, he followed with a threat, suggesting they feed the villagers Baal's flesh to stimulate production. Baal prepared to retaliate. The captive demon trembled as tensions escalated. Hartok and Baal were moments away from clashing when a powerful voice roared across the area, demanding an explanation. It was Kratos. A single application of Bloody Strike sent both to the ground. Infuriated, he reminded them that humans weren't the only beings capable of defecation. His irritation was palpable. He proceeded to inform them that excrement lacking nutritional substance held no utility. What they required was waste matter rich enough to serve as effective compost. Zephyros, perplexed, inquired about the meaning of compost. Kratos clarified that it referred to a component that delivers nourishment to the soil. Typically, such compost is formulated using wood ashes, unwanted vegetation, dirt, broken eggshells, and poultry droppings. For the ashes and weeds, they could repurpose the abandoned homes they had encountered earlier. The complication arose with sourcing eggshells and bird waste. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. He instructed Zephyros to fetch the territorial map. Once unrolled upon the surface of a table, it confirmed his suspicions. It was the identical layout he had encountered within the confines of the game. This meant that if he reached a specific location, he should be able to locate what he sought. He was referring to the nesting grounds of the infernal seabirds. In the game environment, flocks of them populated the area extensively. It implied that these creatures absorbed abundant nutrients from the lands of humans, and subsequently deposited both their excrement and eggs in that territory. Kratos considered it an ideal collection point. Zephyros hesitantly asked if the demon sovereign truly intended to gather waste from the seagulls. Kratos acknowledged the accuracy of the observation. Zephyros then disclosed the name of the area, the Cliff of No Return. There were no platforms or resting points, and anyone unfortunate enough to fall would be consumed by violent tides. Kratos confirmed that he was already aware of those hazards. The reason such a place was beyond player reach in the game was because it lacked systematic access. But in this reality he was confident in his ability to scale it. Upon arrival, the scene was unforgiving. Surging waves and towering stone columns dominated the surroundings. The commanders were bewildered by their liege's intentions. Many had attempted to hunt those seabirds in the past. Each endeavor had ended with the hunters succumbing to the sea's wrath. Kratos explained his strategy. He would ascend the cliff and hurl down a sack filled with excrement and eggshells. He commanded the generals to ensure it would be caught. If successful, everyone would have sustenance. Baal stood in silence. In his mind, he recalled the gaunt demon Hartok had strangled earlier, along with the emaciated figures lining the streets. The ocean's surges remained relentless. As Kratos prepared to leap, memories of his 13th playthrough surfaced. He had tried countless methods to reach the peak. Hundreds of failed attempts, dying repeatedly, had defined that journey. But now he leapt, watched intently by the generals and Zephyros. His self-assurance was unwavering, because he had conquered this obstacle before by exploiting a game-breaking flaw. Gripping a protruding rock, he held so tightly that an indentation formed in the cliff's surface. The commanders and Zephyros stared, astounded. Without delay, Kratos summoned his inventory and unequipped every article of clothing. The sight left them stunned. Only portions of his form, his hair, his flexed arm muscles, and his rear, were visible. The group struggled to contain their amusement at the absurd image. Kratos pushed his weight off the ledge, needing to rotate his torso. Sergi flushed and averted her face. Yet even as she turned, her eyes flicked back with thinly veiled curiosity. It became apparent, she harbored intrigue regarding the demon lord's anatomy. Kratos proceeded to rotate his form, once again removing all garments. His bare backside appeared again. Then he twisted and re-equipped his outfit. Once more he spun and disrobed, exposing himself. He repeated this cycle of rolling and equipping. With each motion upward, he advanced closer to the summit. The repeated appearance of his rear became almost comedic in nature. And at last he reached the top. He stood firmly atop the precipice, clothed and composed. Within a realm governed by a game-like structure, where equipment management and inventories operated like coded functions, and where boundaries marked unreachable zones on a virtual map, Kratos had pieced together all these elements. Through observation and trial, he became certain that reaching this forbidden edge was indeed within the realm of possibility. Baal, driven by the demon sovereign's promise of nourishment, resolved to lend his assistance. Zephyros grew alarmed by Baal's sudden initiative and attempted to halt him, but Baal had already launched himself forward, intent on following the monarch. Zephyros's cries drew Kratos' gaze. In a split second, Baal leapt, aspiring to emulate his liege. But the rocky surface offered no grip. Baal began to plummet. Thankfully, Kratos reached out and caught him mid-fall. At that moment, Kratos was bare-chested, only the upper portion of his form visible from behind the stone ledge, as he clung desperately to Baal's weight. To make it work, he needed to activate the same glitch that had allowed him passage earlier. His forearm veins bulged under the immense pressure. Baal's mass threatened to tear his limbs from their sockets. Inwardly, he questioned the rationale for saving someone like Baal, one of the four mighty generals who posed a potential danger to his rule. Wouldn't it be easier if the general simply ceased to exist? He voiced this internal conflict aloud, declaring that he held no obligation to rescue Baal. While gripping the general, Kratos's mind wandered back to a memory, a time when a peer, eyes red and voice cracking, had come to him for assistance. The professor had refused to accept this junior's paper, aiming instead to exploit the student endlessly for academic labor. The young man had pleaded with Kratos to speak with the professor, believing that the educator would heed the words of Jang Kyol, the most favored scholar. That youth had admired him. Since he was already serving as the top workhorse, perhaps the professor would be swayed. But fear had gripped him. He'd worried about jeopardizing his position, about placing himself in disfavor. So he told the boy that it wasn't his concern and walked away. And ever since he had wondered, what if he had stepped in? What if he had tried just a little harder? If he had pushed himself to his limits, perhaps the face that haunted him in memory would have worn a smile instead of despair. Now that same sensation welled up as Ball clung to him. In that moment of suspended peril, Kratos resolved to do what he hadn't done then. He clenched his jaw, braced himself, and shouted with all his might. His bones groaned under the strain. Summoning every ounce of his physical capability, he heaved the general upward, throwing Ball atop the cliff. The large figure crashed onto the stony surface. Meanwhile, Kratos cradled his fractured arm, pain evident in his posture. Ball, stunned, observed his sovereign's self-inflicted injury. The demon lord had risked his own well-being without necessity. Ball, overcome with emotion, questioned why. For a time, Kratos said nothing. Then, in quiet solemnity, he offered the reason. It was a choice that carried less pain than turning his back on those who relied on him and facing the regret of abandonment. Ball trembled. Moisture welled in his eyes. Within Kratos's thoughts, the act felt like redemption, something he should have done for that pleading junior. The regret of not assisting those in desperate need lingered in him, following him even across dimensions. At that poignant moment, a translucent system notification emerged. It stated that even while still not fully acclimated to the vessel of Demon King Kratos, he had exerted every fiber of strength. As a result, he had earned Baal's genuine gratitude, one of the four supreme commanders. Kratos became aware of the depth of that appreciation. To honor this milestone, the system activated a new feature. From now on, bestowing upon the army a shared sense of deep satisfaction would reward him with a substantial number of points. He reflected on the substantial quantity. The system promptly notified him that the happiness point, or HP, accumulation feature was now active. Kratos pondered what exactly a happiness point was. At first, he assumed it might be something akin to a discount coupon for frozen treats. The system, clearly irritated, rebuked his misunderstanding, questioning what kind of fantasy world would even offer ice cream. Startled by the system's direct and conversational tone, Kratos realized it could respond to his thoughts. It was then clarified that for every demon soldier who experienced satisfaction from a full belly, Kratos would earn a single happiness point. These points could then be used to enhance his attributes. At present, Kratos had access to merely a fifth of the demon lord's total strength. This revelation explained his relative weakness in comparison to his subordinates. The system encouraged him to develop all 5 of his attributes and strive to unlock the demon lord's full capabilities. Curious to try the function, Kratos attempted to increase his stamina by 10%. A notification appeared, explaining that the cost for such an upgrade would be 50 happiness points, a steep price in his view. The system further revealed that abilities could also be upgraded. His current skill, Bloodstrike, was only at its first tier and required a hefty 250 points to level up. Realizing the large quantity of points he'd need, Kratos reasoned that through effective farming, he could steadily accumulate HP and thereby greatly enhance his strength and improve his odds of survival. In addition to this revelation, he received something else: gratitude. With a sly grin, he quietly enjoyed the rare feeling. From Baal's perspective, however, the expression worn by the demon lord was far from comforting. It seemed to communicate a silent threat, a reminder that a debt had been formed and defiance would not end well. To Baal, Kratos appeared as a ruthless leader, one who didn't save lives out of compassion. Shortly after, the demon sovereign lifted a large eggshell and summoned the others' attention. He declared his intent to fill the shell with organic waste and toss it toward them. The trio stood frozen in disbelief, entirely unsure how to respond. As promised, the demon lord launched the container, its contents flung toward the stunned group. The unexpected barrage caused uproar. They had no time to react. It was quite literally a storm of filth. The 3 generals were overwhelmed, certain they had reached their limits. Meanwhile, Kratos believed this was only the beginning. He demanded full dedication to agriculture. The essential elements of natural fertilizer, seabird droppings, fragmented eggshells, scorched wood remnants and properly tilled soil, needed to be blended thoroughly. He summoned Sergi for this task and instructed her to pulverize and combine the materials. Sergi was dumbfounded. The command seemed beneath her station. Despite her numerous limbs, which made her ideally suited for the work, she was incensed. Proclaiming her status as the frigid monarch, she armed herself, stating that her appendages were not intended for menial duties like compost preparation. However, the intense gaze of Kratos silenced her. He offered an alternative, a simpler task. He directed her attention toward Azurat, who still emitted faint wisps of smoke from the electric blasts he had received. All she had to do was remain in place. A straightforward job, no? Thus, the regal monarch of ice became an unwilling mixer of compost. Rumor suggested she remained in that role to this day. Internally, Kratos was close to losing composure. He reminded himself that these generals were all volatile, and one misstep could easily end in disaster. But then he reminded himself of his position. He was the demon sovereign. With nothing but determination and brute resolve, he would press forward. The next phase in producing the fertilizer had arrived, the application of moisture. He summoned Hartok and instructed him to saturate the air with mist. However, Hartok raised objections to this directive, arguing that the resulting humidity would intensify the already unbearable stench. He had no desire to carry out such a revolting command. Then Kratos revealed his trump card once more. His eyes landed squarely on Azurat. No one was eager to serve as a living conduit for electricity, so Azurat swiftly soared through the surroundings, dispersing dampness across the atmosphere. Kratos then consulted Baal to confirm whether the level of moisture sufficed. Baal acknowledged that the consistency had softened with the addition of water, just as their ruler had anticipated. At last, the third stage called for the compost to be relocated to a shaded, arid location and layered with a covering fashioned from seagull plumage. Yet a challenge loomed. The demon lord knew that even producing a small quantity of this material would demand considerable time. To generate enough fertilizer for the expanse of terrain before him, he recognized that a full-scale mobilization of demonic manpower would be unavoidable. His expression hardened. Something troubled him, but it was an obligation he couldn't ignore. Kratos resolved to proceed under the authority granted by his crown. Later that evening, elsewhere within the dominion of demons, a modest wooden shelter came into view. Inside, two infernal beings resided. One reclined upon a makeshift bed. The figure lying down was a young female demon named Flute. She called out to her father, who inquired softly what had happened. Tears welled in her eyes as she offered a heart-wrenching suggestion, that her father should simply consume her. Outraged, the father rebuked the idea vehemently. He reminded her never to utter such despair again. But the girl, still mourning the absence of her mother, insisted, and her words struck deeper than any wound. Then a flashback unfolded. A monstrous demonic beast had once attempted to devour the child. She had cried out for aid, and just before the gaping maw reached her, a figure emerged, shielding her fragile body. It had been her mother. Without time to react, the maternal figure was swallowed whole, sacrificing herself to spare her daughter. In the present, her father spoke gently, explaining that without her, he would have no reason to keep living. Their somber exchange was disrupted by noises outside. The presence of Kratos and his subordinates had arrived. Flute's father froze, overwhelmed at the sight of the demon lord himself, his voice trembling uncontrollably. Hearing his reaction, Kratos concluded the demon still had vitality and thus issued the order for his capture. The father pleaded, explaining that there was no one else to care for his child, and if left alone she might fall prey to more powerful demons. Flute sobbed, begging them to release her father, but the demon lord remained unmoved. He then turned to Zephyros inquiring about the current count. Zephyros confirmed they had secured 20 demons and required 30 more to meet their goal. As Kratos turned to leave the residence, his eyes once again rested on the girl. She continued to cry, believing she was about to lose another parent. Inside the game she had been featured as a berserk adversary, a demon child driven mad. He had frantically tapped his controller, initiating a rapid slash to eliminate her. The look in her eyes now was identical to the one from that moment, and it momentarily stirred something inside him. But he was the demon king and emotion had no place in policy. Maintaining his stoic demeanor, he issued one final decree before departing. He commanded the cessation of all cannibalistic behavior among the demon kin. He also directed Zephyros to assemble the remaining infernal beings and order every one of them to begin working on fertilizer production immediately. At last, the protagonist fully accepted the mantle of leadership, and with it the accompanying burdens and trade-offs. Several days later, the demon inhabitants who had been conscripted had already begun to labor diligently across the fields. Wielding their weapons as crude tools, they turned over the composted earth. Among them, Flute's father, now known as Dyrok, voiced his skepticism. He questioned the value of this toil, convinced that their exertions over the past few days were fruitless. The notion of agriculture to him seemed utterly absurd. A companion cautioned him to be careful with such statements, warning that they could cost him his head. But Dyrok stood resolute, maintaining that regardless of what happened, their fate was already sealed. Even if the terrain became arable, they still lacked any viable crops to sow. As if summoned by the critique, Kratos materialized and addressed the doubt directly, posing a rhetorical question about the future of their planting efforts. Dyrok immediately recognized that he had spoken out of turn and was now in jeopardy. The Demon King instructed him to come along. What Dyrok was unaware of was that Kratos had already identified a potential answer days prior. On the very occasion he had faced opposition from his high-ranking officers, a particular violet blossom had caught his eye. He had instantly recognized it as a candidate for cultivation. And so, he guided Dyrok to stand before this same flower. Kratos informed him that they would be planting the roots of this plant. Baal and a segment of the agricultural unit had already retrieved samples from different areas. Dyrok, now unnerved, humbly explained that the root of this flower was inedible, capable of inducing severe stomach agony, even fatal consequences. The demon sovereign then tugged the flower from the ground, stating plainly that this was the only resource at their disposal. The trial to determine its edibility should have concluded by now, he added. Dyrok was stunned by the revelation. His composure nearly shattered. In a state of panic, Dyrok raced to his daughter's side, crying out in desperation. He questioned the demon lord's morality, demanding to know why such a cruel experiment had been inflicted upon an innocent child. He pleaded for his daughter to be spared from ingesting the roots. Barging into their home, Dyrok halted abruptly at what he witnessed. Flute, appearing far healthier than before, was cheerfully consuming the roots without discomfort. Dyrok, trembling, asked in disbelief if she truly felt fine. Flute affirmed that she did. She also mentioned that both Zephyros and Baal had fed her the same food the previous day, and she hadn't experienced any ill effects. At that moment, Kratos re-entered the scene and inquired whether Dyrok had now come to trust him. In the past, Kratos explained, there had been humans from a distant region who had also managed to transform this very toxic vegetation into a safe food source. They succeeded in growing it and overcame their hunger crises. With a wicked grin stretching across his face, the Demon King unveiled the truth, that this very plant was now recognized in the human realm as the potato. Flute looked up and sincerely expressed her gratitude, thanking Kratos for his compassion toward someone as insignificant as her. At that instant, a translucent prompt manifested before the Demon King. The system had taken note. A portion of the demon population was now content from being well-fed, and Kratos had earned his first happy point. The counter increment, 1 point added. A display showed the current tally of HP. Kratos was genuinely taken aback by the notification. He looked once more at Flute, who beamed with genuine warmth. Then a memory surfaced, a recollection from when he had been merely a player. It was that same Flute, rendered within the game, a naive demon child who had been coerced into doing terrible things just to survive. The image back then starkly contrasted with what stood before him now. A faint smile crept across Kratos' face. He acknowledged to himself that, as a demon lord, perhaps he didn't always need to wear a stern mask. He smiled, awkwardly, perhaps grotesquely. But it was a real smile. Internally, he mused that a little demon like her just needed to eat well and grow up strong. Unfortunately, this sentiment was wholly misunderstood. His attendants misread his intentions, interpreting the look on his face as sinister. Baal, in particular, assumed the Demon King had ulterior motives, that he was merely fattening the girl up to devour her later. To him, Kratos was the embodiment of a truly malevolent monarch. Yet, unbeknownst to them, the expression Kratos had revealed was the one he had always hoped others would see, though it could not have been further from the truth. Following those events, it was revealed that the most remote location within the expansive dominion governed by the demon lord bore the name Chavain de Antir. The entire region was segmented into 5 distinct sectors, and this frigid expanse lay within the most secluded one. Temperatures plunged to icy extremes by nightfall, only to surge into sweltering heat during daylight, a climatic pattern reminiscent of the high-altitude terrain of the Andean Plateau. In historical accounts, inhabitants of the Andes often faced food shortages, leading them to consume wild tubers laced with toxins. But did such desperation lead to extinction? On the contrary, humankind exhibited a remarkable talent, the ability to transform harmful provisions into digestible sustenance. That very human ingenuity was now being emulated by Geshiel, now recognized as Kratos, the reigning demon sovereign. Soon after, Dirac appeared and informed the demon king that the tuberous roots had already been positioned across the cultivated terrain. In response, Kratos instructed Baal to pulverize them. Without hesitation, Baal launched himself high into the air, landing with tremendous force to smash the roots beneath his immense weight. Under such crushing pressure, those potatoes stood no chance of remaining whole. Baal's task was far from over, as he would be repeating this action throughout the entire day. Kratos had devised a meticulous process. The roots were to be frozen under the cold night sky for 5 consecutive evenings. Then, under the scorching heat of the day, they would be softened and subjected to Baal's powerful impact. This repetition, freezing, thawing, pounding, would extract the poisonous content and allow it to dissipate. Once this cycle had been executed enough times, the remnants would be dried, preserved, and lightly heated for consumption. Thus was created the demon realm's version of chunyo, wild potatoes rendered edible through careful preparation. The narrative returned to Kratos, who summoned Zephyros and instructed him to assemble the group of demons assigned to fertilizer production. Wearing a wicked grin, the demon lord declared that it was time for a break, snack time to be precise. He anticipated that his underlings would savor the food. As distribution commenced, the demons formed a queue, awaiting their share. Kratos announced that only 2 pieces would be allotted per individual due to limited supply. Zephyros, noting the sizable reserve of processed potatoes, inquired whether additional portions could be produced. Kratos expressed skepticism, stating that the remaining quantity wasn't sufficient to nourish the entire legion. Instead of consuming all of them, he planned to replant the tubers, allowing them to multiply exponentially. Moments later, as the wild potato portions were distributed, hesitation filled the air. The farming squad looked uneasily at the unfamiliar food, memories of lost kin weighing heavily. Dirac stepped in, reassuring them that the demon king had neutralized the toxic effects and that the roots were now safe for consumption. However, a particularly eccentric demon with a bizarre haircut mocked Dirac, calling him naive. He gestured toward Kratos, describing him as a sinister figure who wouldn't distribute food without an ulterior motive, likely intending to poison them. Yet Dirac remained undeterred. He boldly took a bite of the food. All eyes followed his chewing, their tension growing until he casually swallowed it. With tears brimming in his eyes, he shouted praise for the demon king. The rest of the laborers, observing Dirac's survival, promptly devoured their portions as well. And soon a second line formed, they eagerly sought more. Dirac, basking in his moment of vindication, was filled with pride. It was true, the demon lord had genuinely provided them with edible nourishment. The odd-haired demon, now swayed, began to lead a chant. Raising his left arm, he bellowed with enthusiasm, "Yes, Kratos." The demon king, however, was unimpressed by the awkward slogan and silently resolved to replace that ridiculous cheer at a later date. Off to the side, Zephyros studied Kratos' expression. He noted that the demon lord's countenance reflected unwavering belief that even in this barren wasteland, he would produce viable food. In that gaze, Zephyros sensed the possibility that Kratos might indeed be the one to finally end the cycle of starvation and despair that plagued their kind. At that very moment, the interface reappeared. A system notification declared that a segment of Kratos' forces was content due to having eaten. This time, the tally rose by 50 happy points, a reward for successfully feeding 50 members of the agricultural squad. The new cumulative total displayed boldly: HP equals 51. The protagonist observed the unfolding scene with visible amusement. A subtle grin crept across his face as he internally acknowledged that the total number of points accrued so far was quite respectable. With this accumulation, he could now afford to bolster his strength a bit. However, a decision had yet to be made on which attribute would be prioritized. At the moment, he remained uncertain. Perhaps it would be more prudent to continue stockpiling points for the time being. While he contemplated dividing labor between the fertilizer production group and the wild potato extraction team, Zephyros began to rally the attention of the field workers. The astute assistant had devised a plan to spread word throughout the village that a consumable crop could now be cultivated even in this desolate terrain. An incentive was offered: Any demon who unearthed wild potatoes would receive food coupons redeemable for chunyo. The announcement stirred celebration among the farming squad, while Kratos quietly evaluated Zephyros. He mused that the subordinate was every bit as clever as he appeared. Despite his irritating personality, he was undeniably one of the most resourceful allies in the group. Thanks to this campaign, the village demons diligently scoured the earth, unearthing every last wild potato. Meanwhile, fertilizer grinder Sergi and artificial precipitation specialist Hartok remained hard at work, each fulfilling their respective assignments. Lastly, Aserat, still securely restrained, awaited his next relocation. Kratos had merely been shifting the location where his living lightning conductor would be positioned. Upon determining the most suitable area, preparations were finalized. The demon lord then proceeded to discharge a series of electric bolts upon the familiar target, harnessing Aserat's endurance for the benefit of nitrogen enrichment. He truly toiled to ensure proper soil infusion. With fertilizer production reaching adequate levels, it was time to commence the subsequent phase, distributing the compost uniformly across the terrain. However, the sheer size of the land posed a significant challenge. The territory was far too extensive for a malnourished workforce sustained by only a few morsels of chunyo. Suddenly, Aserat summoned the strength to plead with the demon lord, asking for death to be swift. Yet the request was ignored. Instead, another jolt was sent his way. In Kratos' mind, eliminating an individual capable of remaining operational even while famished, all thanks to his regeneration trait, was foolish. He considered it a free source of nitrogen after all. Still, the dilemma of territorial expansion lingered. The Demon King pondered whether reinforcements were the only viable solution. He had previously instructed Zephyros to send requests for aid to the Star Masters. In the message, Zephyros had penned a firm directive: all offensive actions must cease, and manpower should be redirected toward agricultural development. Although this appeal had been dispatched to every sector within the Star region, no replies had been received. Kratos found this worrisome. He even speculated whether the courier had perished from hunger before reaching any recipients. A serious problem loomed if farmland expansion could not proceed swiftly. Elsewhere, in the realm of the demons, the first star zone, named the Cliff of the Dead, harbored its own developments. A servant knelt before his superior, relaying a reconnaissance report. Demon Lord Kratos had genuinely begun agricultural operations and seemed to have succeeded in creating edible sustenance. The master of this domain sighed, attributing Kratos' actions to fear, specifically fear of himself. This sinister figure, one whose power amplified with each demon's demise, interpreted Kratos' agricultural efforts as a tactic to halt both warfare and famine, thereby slowing his own growth. This elderly, Zeus-like entity was Saruthal, overseer of the First Star region and commonly referred to as the Father of the Dead. It was disclosed that his subordinate had already intercepted and eliminated the messengers dispatched to the other star sectors. In essence, the appeals for aid had been silenced, reaching no one beyond Saruthal's domain. The ruthless overlord was resolute: demons must perish from starvation. Only then would their corpses serve as nourishment for him and his forces. Saruthal declared his intent to exterminate Kratos and claim the demon throne for himself. He issued a critical mission to his adjutant, Ficamir. The order was simple yet grave: annihilate every vestige of Kratos' agricultural progress. With an ominous tone, Saruthal formally proclaimed war. Ficamir, ignited by the opportunity for conflict, bristled with excitement. Back at the location of the designated living lightning conductor, Aserat shuddered as a biting gust swept through the area. Ficamir eventually disclosed his presence. He remarked that Kratos was exceptionally cruel for reducing Aserat to a breathing husk, merely to serve as a deterrent to others. He then reassured Aserat not to fret, explaining that his superior, Saruthal, appreciated his fierceness and would gladly welcome him once Kratos was eliminated. Ficamir summoned his elite unit, phantasmal entities known as wraiths. With manic enthusiasm, he bellowed a command to obliterate the barren land beyond repair. The spectral soldiers lost no time and gleefully embarked on their destructive rampage. One of them stumbled upon the compost scattered across the ground, and in his typical cluelessness, Ficamir instructed them to fling the waste across the terrain, cackling in delight. He reasoned that the enemy might attempt to reclaim and reuse the manure, so it should be evenly distributed to prevent retrieval. With blind zeal, the wraiths dutifully worked the material into the earth, dispersing it so thoroughly that no visible traces remained. Ficamir's unhinged laughter echoed, while Asarat watched the ridiculous display with an expression of disbelief and silence. He could only exhale in resignation. He recalled Crito's exact instructions about finely grinding the manure and mixing it deep into the land. Ironically, this very task was now being accomplished by Ficamir, who remained blissfully unaware of his contribution. In Asarat's mind, a lingering question arose: what exactly are these fools trying to accomplish? The following morning, just before sunrise, one wraith commented on the endless nature of their assignment. Nevertheless, his peers remained tirelessly committed to their labor. When he voiced his complaint, he was promptly scolded for slacking. They operated under the belief that if even a single corner remained untouched, the demon king Kratos would transform it into farmland. The indolent wraith then questioned why wraith number 2718, notorious for his laziness, was especially diligent on that day. The numbered wraith confessed to his typical slothful tendencies but noted that something felt different this time. Observing the meticulously worked earth, he admitted feeling pride, as though he had contributed to something meaningful. The lazy wraith was left dumbfounded. After clicking his tongue in annoyance, he declared that he too would be a fool for the day. He resumed tilling beside the others. Unexpectedly, the scene took a turn. So focused were the wraiths on their exertions that they lost track of time. When dawn broke, they had failed to retreat, and all perished beneath the morning sun. Yet they passed with contentment, gratified by their efforts. The once empty fields were now cultivated with purpose. All phantoms in the expanse had faded, except for Ficamir. With tears welling in his eyes, he mourned his comrades, proud of their dedication. He silently wished their souls would find repose and wondered with solemn anticipation how Kratos would respond to their unintended accomplishment. Elsewhere, within the barn where the harvested potatoes were stored, Kratos could be heard murmuring about how tilling had taken more time than anticipated. Gazing at the dormant vegetables, he explained to Zephyros that potatoes in such a state wouldn't sprout, rendering immediate planting ineffective. He likened the condition to a tuber peacefully resting underground, abruptly yanked out by its stem, thrown into shock and left biologically frozen. Deep in contemplation, Kratos considered that dormancy could be interrupted more rapidly by storing the potatoes at 4 degrees Celsius for 2 to 3 weeks before transferring them to a warmer, darker location. He intended to request Sergi's aid in cooling them with her frost-born magic, but she was fuming with rage at present. Hartok likewise was currently unreliable. Kratos knew that provoking both simultaneously could be perilous, so an alternative solution was necessary. As a last resort, the Demon King had even instructed the farming squad to perform physical drills near the potato cache, in the hopes that their body heat might hasten the warming process. They all ended up exhausted rather quickly, rendering that strategy a failure as well. Thus, the issue remained unresolved. Left with few alternatives, Kratos resolved to head over to the farmland and attempt whatever measures he still could. His focus narrowed to at least enriching the earth with nitrogen. A short while later, Kratos stood silently before the completely turned and fertilized soil. The ground had been thoroughly tilled and integrated. The pungent odor hung thick in the air, so intense that Asarat lost consciousness from the fumes. The demon lord stood stunned, speechless at the sight of the now prepared fields. He questioned internally how such a feat had come to pass, suspecting a miracle. Suddenly, an oblivious figure burst into laughter, the same fool who had unknowingly contributed to the miracle. He cackled in triumph, declaring their success, but his gloating was short-lived. Baal, looming behind him, lifted him effortlessly and presented him to the demon lord. This individual was none other than Ficamir, who had attempted to remain hidden. Kratos recognized him immediately as one of the notorious bosses from the Cliff of the Dead. He speculated that Ficamir might have arrived as backup. Without delay, Kratos demanded to know the reason for Ficamir's presence, a question that caused the demon to tense in panic. Just as Ficamir opened his mouth to reply, a swift blow from Kratos interrupted him. Zephyros, bewildered, questioned why the demon lord would strike before hearing a response. Kratos clarified that the act of withholding information was already suspicious enough, and sometimes brute force was the most effective interrogation tool. Ficamir, though pained, conceded that this approach was to be expected from the Demon King. Still, the demon remained tight-lipped, until he was subjected to a relentless barrage of punches. Blow after blow rained down. Eventually, Kratos himself grew winded. Ficamir lay motionless, barely conscious. Then, a prompt from the system materialized, reminding Kratos of his ability to enhance attributes using accumulated HP. With 51 points available, he invested in boosting his stamina. Refreshed, He resumed pummeling the unfortunate demon with renewed vigor. Thousands more strikes followed. In this act of merciless interrogation, Kratos demonstrated his fitness for the role of Demon King. Ultimately, Ficamir broke. He confessed not only his actions but the plot to eliminate Kratos altogether. The scheme traced back to Saruthal, who had deliberately severed the flow of reinforcements. The goal was to grow stronger as more demons starved. Zephyros remarked that such sabotage amounted to insurrection. He advised Kratos that eliminating Saruthal would send a clear message to those protesting the halted expeditions. However, Kratos recognized that even if he succeeded in taking Saruthal down, other adversaries would persist. What he truly required was a definitive method to overcome them. Zephyros warned that Saruthal was no ordinary enemy. Kratos was already aware. Saruthal possessed a spectral ability, allowing his body to shift into an incorporeal form. Even within the game, Saruthal had been a constant menace on the intricate terrain of the Cliff of the Dead, transforming the entire encounter into an elaborate pursuit. Still, Kratos had already begun formulating a plan. As in the game, if exterminating pests was impossible due to their concealment, the answer was simple: extract them from their den. Elsewhere, Flute found herself standing before Aserat. She looked upward timidly. The mere sight of her nearby presence visibly irritated him. She initiated a hesitant conversation, lowering her head in gratitude. She expressed thanks for his sacrifice as it was the reason they now had sustenance. However, praise directed toward a demon for noble deeds was considered deeply offensive. Aserat seethed. He accused Flute of derision and threatened her life. Frightened, Flute fled. With a burning glare, Aserat issued a vow, one drenched in fury. The moment he escaped, he would hunt Kratos down and destroy him. His moment of solace was abruptly interrupted as a chorus of demonic voices rose in melody directed toward him. From a distance, his gaze locked onto Kratos approaching with a waving banner. As the image grew clearer, the banner's inscription came into view: "Congratulations. Second Conductor of Thunder in the department." Alongside him was Ficamir, trussed up identically to Aserat. This unhinged entourage chanted jubilant hymns, as if commemorating the induction of a fresh recruit into their labor force. The agricultural detachment was gradually expanding its membership. Aserat mulled over the title of Second Conductor of Thunder. Moisture welled in his eyes at the hopeful prospect of being released. The thought of finally being spared from being a perpetual spit-roasted avian stirred deep longing. Yet within moments, Ficamir was merely positioned adjacent to him. No soul even considered unfastening him from the pole. With fervor, Kratos erupted into bellows, activating his sanguine surge technique. Aserat's stomach dropped as the full weight of reality set in. Kratos intended for both of them to share the burden of lightning absorption. The pair, defeated in spirit, yielded to their fate. All the while, Saruthal observed from afar through his scrying orb. The notorious overlord shrieked with horror as his elite subordinate, Ficamir, was officially baptized as the next electro-grilled minion. The unsightly, celibate demon monarch persisted, unleashing strike after strike. Ficamir's wails echoed, his form writhing under the surges. Saruthal wept for his underling's torment. Still, Kratos showed no mercy. The thunder cracked. Ficamir's cries escalated, almost indistinguishable from unholy moans. He was beginning to show signs of perverse enjoyment. Surveying this grotesque display, Saruthal howled in protest. At that very instant, Kratos turned his attention sideways. There hovered the familiar reconnaissance specter from the game, a spectral avian clenching a crystal globe. This confirmed Saruthal's active surveillance. Rage simmered anew within Kratos. His adversary had not only sabotaged his crops, but was now watching with contemptuous amusement. He vowed to ensure Saruthal rued the day he meddled. By morning, young Fluck was seen burrowing around in the earth. Aserat monitored her from his constrained vantage point. He noticed the roughened texture of her palms. The roasted warrior questioned her motives. She meekly explained her desire to assist. After all, the Demon King, the 4 exalted generals, and every grown-up were toiling tirelessly in the fields. She longed to contribute. Aserat scoffed, branding her a naive, low-tier demon child. He grumbled that the idiot tethered beside him had already cultivated the patch she was digging. He suggested she direct her efforts somewhere useful. Hearing that, Fluck beamed with gratitude. She extended heartfelt thanks to Ficamir for tilling the field and offering himself as an additional lightning conduit. Ficamir's eyes glistened. Her words moved him. Suddenly the agony felt worthwhile. Asarat muttered under his breath that the man had officially gone off the rails. He mocked their agricultural ambitions in this forsaken land. He pointed out that the absurd potato they were trying to raise hadn't even sprouted. According to him, unless the spud cellar was warmed, no buds would grow. He predicted starvation. Fluck took that statement to heart and dashed away, almost skipping with determination. Asarat rolled his eyes, convinced that a feeble demon like her couldn't change anything. At high noon, Zephyros expressed subtle unease about the demon monarch's scheme. He suspected that Saruthal was surely aware of their ambush. He doubted the commander would risk showing up to rescue Ficamir. Kratos, however, expected no such thing. He anticipated Saruthal would dispatch underlings first. The goal was to decimate every single one of them, to force Saruthal's hand. He commanded his forces to ensure no survivors remained. The cultivator battalion now stood sentinel around the second lightning pillar. As the reconnaissance wraith soared above, Saruthal sneered at Kratos' strategy. He believed this idle vigil would prove fruitless. While admitting it was unfortunate for Ficamir, Saruthal remained fixated on one objective, crippling the harvest. He deployed his crop wraiths. And for the surprise of no one, they appeared at the heart of the potato deposit. Numerous reptilian phantoms emerged. Then, with no hesitation, the spectral invaders surged forward. Saruthal gave the directive to annihilate the entire stockpile of potatoes, ordering them to crush and obliterate every last one. The harvest phantoms stormed the storage barn. Unbeknownst to them, everything was unfolding exactly as Kratos had foreseen. The crop specters found themselves startled. Positioned atop the structure, the demon sovereign awaited. With a sly grin curving his lips, Kratos acknowledged their presence like a host welcoming guests to their final resting place. The ghostly intruders faltered, taken aback by the ambush. His mind drifted back to his initial encounter with these exact entities during his gaming days. Moments steeped in hopelessness. These were Saruthal's second-tier elite division. The greatest hazard lay in their tendency to swarm en masse. A mere touch from their incorporeal forms could trigger rapid aging in the afflicted. Worse still, they could replicate the skill sets currently equipped by their opponents. Truly an affliction. But Kratos, now seasoned in the mechanics of this world, had already calculated their downfall. With a vicious sneer, he declared his readiness to roast the first of them. Lightning-based implements were their kryptonite. The specters realized they had walked into a trap and began to withdraw. However, Kratos warned them that the real snare had only just begun. The ghouls glimpsed crimson streaks near the entryway, blood that Kratos had deliberately smeared the night before. Now activating the second tier of his technique, Kratos brought his palm crashing against the ground, unleashing arcs of electricity. The current surged along the blood channels until it reached the door, where it surged upward like a net of lightning. The move, known as wide-range crimson discharge, electrified the entire vicinity. In that moment, the crop wraiths resembled writhing motes, floating helpless. The strike landed, eliciting their silent shrieks, even though they possessed no vocal cords. With their resistance neutralized, physical strikes now became effective. Kratos summoned the cultivation regiment. These fierce warriors, long aching for battle, barreled into the fray with scythes and rakes so lethal they would intimidate any foe. Though outwardly unimpressive, these soldiers were secretly the most formidable units of the final battleground. With that knowledge, Kratos no longer considered the crop wraiths a threat. For the first time he felt like a cold, calculating apex demon ruler. He scanned the area for any lingering phantoms that had survived the barrage. Determined to personally finish them off, he prepared his next move. But a piercing cry shattered his focus. Fluck emerged from beneath the mountainous heap of potatoes. Her sudden appearance stunned Kratos. A spectral assailant locked onto her. Her father, locked in his own skirmish, was unable to reach her. Kratos, agitated by the chaotic unpredictability of it all, forced himself to prioritize. Eliminating as many fleeing phantoms as possible had to take precedence. Still, his eyes stayed fixed on Fluck. He knew the range of his crimson discharge wouldn't reach her position. In a desperate act, he hurled a potato toward the ghost. Of course he knew it was futile, but instinct took over. The vegetable bounced off the specter's head, which then caught it mid-air. To his astonishment, the tuber began to pulsate like a capturing sphere. A pink vortex enveloped it, and the creature's essence was absorbed into it. Then, poof, a faint sound echoed. The soul emerged from the potato and ricocheted toward the stockpile. Distracted, the remaining crop wraiths retreated unnoticed. Kratos blinked in disbelief at what had just occurred. The potato had sprouted. Suddenly, understanding dawned. these apparitions accelerated aging. They had inadvertently jump-started the dormant biological rhythm of the potatoes. Without pause, Kratos clasped Fluck in his arms. His gaze softened slightly as he offered her an expression of approval. Her body trembled. Turning to his militia, he summoned their attention. The time for drawing Saruthal out had ended. From now on they would take the initiative. An offensive approach would serve them better. Elsewhere, someone's eyes fluttered open. Confusion clouded their vision. The location was none other than lightning pole number 1. It was Asarat. His mind muddled, he pondered his own identity and purpose. The warm sunlight bathed his face, and he felt a fleeting moment of gratitude. Then his stomach let out a deep growl. He came to understand that, despite his condition, a deep yearning for existence still burned within him. His focus shifted when he heard his name being called. It was Fluck. She expressed her gratitude, explaining that thanks to his tip regarding potato sprouting, everything had turned out well. She had even received a generous supply of chunyo as a result. She went on, mentioning how Kratos had assembled a considerable force of agrarian warriors. Yet, by this point, Azarat was no longer registering her words. His entire attention had zeroed in on the food she carried. The moment he laid eyes on the edible chunyo in Fluck's possession, his mind unraveled. Overwhelmed by hunger, he fixated on the meal. Aware of his craving, Fluck attempted to feed him by tossing a piece his way. Unfortunately, the morsel struck him square in the eye. Letting out a sharp groan, he threatened the child in irritation. Apologizing, she tried again. This time, she launched 3 pieces simultaneously, hoping at least one would land correctly. One chunk successfully entered his mouth, while the other 2 landed on his eyes once more. Despite the pain, tears welled up in his eyes, not from sorrow but from the sheer flavor. As he chewed, the delight overwhelmed him. At that moment, a notification arrived for Kratos. A member of his demon legion had experienced joy. 1 happy point was added. His cumulative total now stood at 302. This puzzled Kratos slightly. With the latest batch of recruits who had eaten chunyo, the total should have been 300 demons and Fluck. He couldn't quite figure out the identity of the extra source of happiness, but ultimately dismissed the thought. More points only meant more power, and he intended to conserve them for the upcoming raid on Saruthal. Rousing his troops, he ordered the cultivation warriors to press forward. With fervent energy, he rallied them in the name of a prosperous yield. Hours passed until they reached the threshold of Sarathal's stronghold. Saruthal, foreseeing the assault, instructed his minions to sever the rope bridge. As the bridge collapsed, the phantoms mocked the approaching demons, ridiculing them with jeers. Their amusement didn't last long. Without hesitation, Kratos lunged across the chasm. Panic swept through the wraiths, until they realized he had miscalculated. He was plummeting. The phantoms erupted with laughter, calling him brainless for attempting such a reckless leap. Then the laughter died. They spotted fragments of his form embedded into the cliff face, once again with his posterior exposed. The ultimate glitch maneuver had been activated. The spirits flushed, blushing in discomfort. Slowly, Kratos began his ascent, turning once, turning again, revealing his backside with each twist. His expression remained grim and menacing. With a few more contortions, the demon lord reached the top. The specters, thoroughly unsettled, groaned in disgust. Kratos then gestured toward Zephyros, signaling the next phase of the operation. Zephyros gave a subtle nod in return. Kratos bolted inside. As per his calculated tactics, the food wraiths were expected to fear the potatoes. But by charging in unarmed and alone, he increased the odds they would fall for the trap. As predicted, Saruthal dispatched his food wraiths, believing the demon king lacked the cursed tubers. Any contact with him would be their triumph. The spectral attackers surged forward. Kratos initiated a concealed maneuver, his so-called quantum leap. A glitch-based strategy now branded with an impressive name. Once more, his frame merged with the terrain, his posterior protruding as before. Then he vanished. The wraiths, unnerved, muttered about the bizarre nature of his movements, wondering when he gained the ability to phase through solid matter. They sensed him overhead. Lunging, they managed to grab hold of him. Victory seemed imminent, until he disappeared yet again. This marked the 19th occasion on which Kratos had executed this plan. He had memorized every crevice of the terrain. Having visualized the entire battlefield by combining all areas of enemy spawn from the game, he stood dead center, surrounded entirely by the food wraiths. Drawing in a breath, Kratos steadied himself. The phantoms believed he must be fatigued, even as the sovereign of demons. But Kratos declared internally that he no longer stood there as a ruler, he was a seasoned gamer. In the distance, Zephyros shouted the cue. He ordered the next step. From all directions the cultivation squad appeared, launching their weapons. Not balls but potatoes. The tubers struck the agricultural phantoms directly. Simultaneously, Kratos instructed them to commence cultivation efforts. A few more seconds passed, just enough to fully appreciate the grandeur of the moment. Initially, Zephyros harbored some uncertainty regarding the strategy, yet soon came to grasp that the demon sovereign had once again devised a flawless approach. Earlier, Kratos had informed him that while he lured the crop wraiths into a single confined location, Zephyros was to direct the cultivation sentries along a mapped-out route. Zephyros reviewed the diagram of a forsaken, ancient watercourse, nothing but a cul-de-sac or so it appeared. Kratos insisted otherwise. He declared that something was indeed hidden there, a covert passage, one he had personally uncovered. Following his escape from the nightmarish cliff of the deceased, just before entering the ultimate zone, he had explored thoroughly and noticed something unusual. Despite the area appearing empty, the craftsmanship of the environment seemed deliberate. Then he observed an odd section on the stone wall. After slashing it with a blade, the wall shifted open. That's how the areas had been linked. The hidden corridor bridged the battlefield where the initial confrontation with Saruthal had occurred and the cavern deep beyond. At first, he hadn't been able to access it until he cleared the surroundings. Only then could he claim the elixir of metamorphosis. If such an artifact existed in the real realm, he was advised to retrieve it. The elixir was a distillation of numerous fallen fleshly souls. It could only be ingested once, with its exact effects unknown. Back in the present, the field hands rejoiced as they gathered the sprouted spuds. The sight of it implied they were ready to sow them. Flute's father thought tenderly of her and of how they might finally enjoy full meals. But witnessing all of this, Kratos' features darkened. A memory surfaced. He once starved so severely that a kindly elder woman offered him food. She had even promised a hearty supper if he could just hold out a little longer. The next thing he remembered, an ambulance was parked nearby. That thought soured his expression. With that grim recollection fresh, he declared a statement that caused the workers to cheer. Anyone who interfered with their long-awaited nourishment would be utterly annihilated. Just then someone called out to the overlord. It was Baal, announcing his readiness to assist against Saruthal. Kratos, however, ordered Baal to focus on carrying the provisions. Combat belonged to the head of the chain. Meanwhile, Saruthal invoked the great spirit of glacial heart. He beseeched it to ensnare more souls with its frozen wrath and grant him a surge of reinforcements and might. Out of nowhere, Kratos landed a forceful kick square into his back, sending him to the ground. Saruthal lay stunned, face against the dirt, shocked by the Demon King's sudden arrival. Kratos coldly responded that it was no longer his concern. Pest extermination was now underway. As Saruthal remained crouched, Kratos loomed above. The former rebuked Kratos, branding him foolish to believe he could triumph single-handedly. Saruthal's form began to morph. He disclosed his genuine prowess. Despite the dramatic transformation, Kratos showed no reaction. His expression was blank, almost disinterested, for he had witnessed this countless times, 19 to be exact. In past playthroughs, while chasing the ever-fleeing Saruthal across the hazardous cliffs, aged Kimchi's player frequently ran into his minions. By the end, nearly every creature inhabiting those bluffs had been eradicated. Eventually, Saruthal retreated into the chamber containing the Heart of Ice Spirit. A fearsome relic, allegedly forged from the death of an ancient drake, it unleashed a chilling energy that ensnared wandering phantoms in the land of the living. Saruthal made attempts to summon additional allies using the relic's force, but the paladin always arrived in time for the final confrontation. There, Saruthal activated his most formidable power. He conjured a whirling gale, signifying his acceptance of Kratos' formidable nature. Gradually, the vortex assumed shape, an exact replication of Kratos himself. Saruthal was convinced this was the key to victory. Kratos knew all too well what was happening. Saruthal's signature ability allowed him to flawlessly duplicate his adversary's attributes and embody them. That was the climax of the encounter. At that moment, Saruthal possessed identical statistics to Kratos' own character, which were maximized to their limits. With staggering offensive capacity and a near untouchable evasion trait, even a single misstep meant instantaneous defeat. Nonetheless, the attributes that Saruthal replicated were from the current demon monarch Kratos, whose prowess was no longer as formidable. Saruthal lunged forward. Simultaneously, Kratos received a prompt to utilize his HP to acquire various attribute enhancements. He had the option to allocate 10% more to his existing stamina, which stood at 30%, as well as his psychological fortitude, bodily power, nimbleness, and arcane energy, each resting at 20%. With a reserve of 302 HP, Kratos spent 50 of them to elevate his agility to 30%. Saruthal was taken aback when Kratos sidestepped his strike with ease. Following that, Kratos delivered a punch with all the force he could summon. Another 50 points were consumed to boost his brute force from 20% to 30%. He met Saruthal's clenched fist directly with his own. The impact prompted Saruthal to cry out in pain, bewildered as to how Kratos remained unscathed. Kratos retorted that cultivating land also required intellect. Enraged, Saruthal attempted to unleash the bloody strike technique, but Kratos had already invested 50 points to amplify his magical force, raising it to 30%, and another 50 to augment his mental endurance to the same level. Both unleashed their lightning-based abilities. Saruthal was caught by surprise as his spell backfired, and he was struck by his own electrical discharge. The so-called Zeus impersonator began to liquefy, reduced to a viscous pool. His form now resembled that of gelatinous goo. At that moment, Kratos was informed that he had expended his HP to elevate all of his core attributes to a uniform level of 30%. Then, a notification appeared. His development quest was now fulfilled. As a consequence, a fresh ability had become accessible. Summon Farmer's Throne, which required 100 HP to unlock. This throne, a clear homage to Game of Thrones, was armed with an array of sturdy agricultural instruments. Kratos found the timing fortuitous, as he was in need of superior equipment. Even as a puddle, Saruthal still had the ability to speak. He addressed Kratos, questioning whether he believed the battle had concluded. Kratos responded in the negative. He was well aware that all second-phase encounters had a follow-up transformation. Saruthal's mass shifted again, now transforming into an archaic, malevolent dragon. He claimed that this was his true origin. Kratos was stunned. Witnessing it firsthand, the creature's offensive capability and reservoir of vitality were staggering. But it was expected. Saruthal served as the boss directly preceding the game's ultimate antagonist. Kratos, however, felt no dread. That was precisely when Baal and the agricultural enforcers arrived. He informed Saruthal that he had already emerged from the final stage himself. Then he issued a challenge. What could Saruthal possibly do now? Saruthal froze. Overwhelmed by the sight of reinforcements, he began to panic. He pleaded for a conversation to negotiate. But his appeal came too late. The farm enforcers stormed toward him, impelled by their yearning for a successful yield. They unleashed their accumulated frustration on Saruthal for disrupting their tilling. Saruthal begged for leniency. Kratos recognized that he could overcome Saruthal through direct combat, but the entity's capacity for speech and motion gave him pause. It didn't feel right to destroy it with his own hands. Still, he observed that his comrades were too malnourished to land efficient strikes. They had been battering Saruthal for some time now, yet he refused to perish. He contemplated a more effective tactic. Kratos activated the Summon Farmer's Throne skill, draining 100 HP and leaving him with just 2 points. A beam of verdant luminescence descended from the heavens, slowly lowering the throne. Then, without warning, it plummeted with explosive velocity. Kratos flinched in astonishment. The throne landed squarely atop Saruthal, generating a crater upon impact. The farm guards exulted. One demon jubilantly praised their monarch for not allowing Saruthal to simply expire, but instead, annihilating him with a brutal, skull-crushing blow. They admired how ruthless, savage, and infernal the move was, worthy of a true overlord. Another cried out that such a feat could only be pulled off by the demon king himself, and that lesser beings like them could never imitate such dominance. They chanted Kratos' name in triumph. He blended with the celebration, shouting with pride. Elsewhere, among the lightning-bound, Fikimir came to a realization. With his superior defeated, he now understood that it was time for his own ascension. By now, the entire farmland had been cultivated. The purpose of Lightning Rod number 2 had been fulfilled. With the raid concluded, their principal objective was achieved. The potato shoots had sprouted, and Kratos had successfully eliminated every blight that jeopardized the upcoming yield. With those hurdles overcome, he exclaimed with fervor that it was the moment to sow the tubers. Yet before they could vacate the premises, the crystalline orb situated upon the pedestal stirred. Kratos took notice. A notification appeared. confirming that his objective of vanquishing Saruthal on the cliff of the departed for the 20th instance had now been fulfilled. That led him to wonder whether he had simply resumed from the 19th attempt in the game. The system then alerted him of a concealed scenario now being unlocked. A sealed essence confined within the core of frozen spirit had been released due to mishandling. The heart of ice began to emit vapor. Its structure opened gradually. As Kratos approached, he was met with astonishment. A diminutive azure hatchling emerged. He stood speechless, eyes wide in disbelief. The juvenile dragon noticed him. With excitement it uttered a name, T-Bone. Their gazes locked in stillness. The small WRM pondered if this bizarre entity before him might be his parent. As Kratos extended his hand, the little one shuddered with sensitivity. The dragon remembered hatching from its shell in pitch blackness, overwhelmed with fear, yet now relieved that its father had found him. That sense of comfort quickly faded once it got a good look at Kratos' unfortunate visage. Even though Kratos made an admiring remark about the creature's cuteness, the hatchling quaked in apprehension. As the group began to exit the chamber, the overzealous agricultural enforcers jokingly hollered about cooking the baby drake. This left the creature misty-eyed. Kratos rebuked them, labeling them fools, and reminded them that raising the beast first would yield greater returns. This, of course, led the little one to suspect that its supposed caretaker might actually intend to consume it. Kratos came to a halt when he noticed the awaiting crowd. The demons had gathered to welcome back the farming corps, their expressions sincere with joy. Fluck ran directly into her father's arms. Families reunited in warmth and relief. The baby dragon's cheeks turned rosy as it sensed the shared affection in the air. He glanced up at the figure holding him, realizing that perhaps they weren't so frightening after all. That was until he looked once more at the face of his so-called guardian. His opinion reversed immediately. No, they were absolutely terrifying. As twilight descended, the hatchling trembled in a shadowy corner. He cautiously peeked out, only to catch sight of the demon sovereign's ominous expression again. It made the little dragon assume they were merely biding their time until he matured enough to be eaten. Meanwhile, the overlord himself was absorbed in thought, primarily concerning how to nourish the young drake. He had heard somewhere that juvenile dragons fed on polished minerals, yet there wasn't a single gemstone in sight. Only piles of corroded scrap littered the storage. Zephyros soon arrived to give his report. As anticipated, significant setbacks had arisen during the construction of embankments. To cultivate vegetation properly, earthen ridges were necessary, raised mounds lining the fields. Ideally, such structures required untainted soil, but their terrain was littered with fragments of stone. Despite their efforts, each attempt by the farm guards to dig deeper resulted in the emergence of more debris. The baby dragon misinterpreted the situation, thinking he was already being forced into labor like the others, though in reality, Kratos merely held him. The demon lord reflected that their terrain more closely resembled a coal excavation site than a field. At the current pace, merely removing the stones would take an eternity. Worse yet, relying so heavily on the workforce daily would rapidly deplete the store of chunios intended for incentives. Even the prospect of receiving backup from other high-ranking demons wouldn't solve the dilemma. A sinister expression again crept across Kratos' face. He daydreamed about being the protagonist in a fantasy serial, one with the ability to summon a magical companion. He imagined some sort of burrowing beast like a wombat, capable of clearing the stones effortlessly. The hatchling in his grasp visibly shook once more, unnerved by the increasingly dreadful countenance his parent was making. Kratos observed Fluke as she diligently dug into the terrain. Her expression was firm with resolve. He continued watching her and came to the realization that it was time to stop complaining and instead devise a solution. While he was immersed in his own reflections, a sudden cry pierced the air, razor squall. Kratos turned pale. A colossal whirlwind was barreling toward them, gaining speed rapidly. It slipped his mind completely. He had known that this expansive barren land occasionally produced vents that released slicing gales at random intervals, and getting caught in one would result in being torn to shreds in moments. He shouted for everyone to seek shelter behind the stone formations. They scrambled toward anything that could provide shadow and dropped low to the ground. Kratos also bolted for cover, but even though the slicing wind was still a distance away, the sheer force of the air pressure was staggering. What he had experienced during gameplay didn't even come close. This was a calamity of nature, the greatest peril to cultivation efforts. But amidst the chaos, he spotted Fluke dashing toward the incoming vortex. Kratos' eyes widened. She wasn't fleeing, she was heading to Azurat. Her father took off after her. Irritation surged in Kratos at the reckless girl. Without hesitation, he handed the hatchling to his own father, instructing him to protect the young Drake, warning that anyone who pursued him would face consequences. Bale cried out in protest, warning Kratos that the area was too treacherous, that death was likely. Kratos was fully aware of the risk. But he couldn't bear the thought of losing either his vital lightning conductor or an essential laborer. Cultivation wasn't some peaceful, leisurely endeavor involving leisurely fruit picking. Fluke, struggling, attempted to move the pole, but her efforts were fruitless. Azurat shouted for her to abandon the attempt and escape. In Kratos' mind, he likened both agriculture and survival to waging war. He yelled at the child to step aside, then drove his foot into the stake, shattering it. Azurat let out a piercing scream as he toppled, smacking the ground face first. The demon sovereign's cheek was sliced open. Fluke, though lacerated across her body, continued attempting to untie the restraints. Azurat insisted the knot was one of the binding types, so tight not even one of the 4 heavenly generals could release it. He was adamant she wouldn't succeed and told her again to retreat. Fluke gasped in shock as she was abruptly lifted. Kratos had hoisted both her and the stake. The young WRM could sense the sheer exertion of strength. It knew its guardian was no paragon of durability. Blood poured from Kratos' wounds as he let out a roar and sprinted with all the energy he could muster. The tiny Drake, understanding the toll on his caretaker's body, gazed in astonishment at how far the Demon King was willing to go for others. The bladed wind storm drew near. Kratos ran, leaking crimson from his injuries as the storm approached with unrelenting speed. Eventually his body gave in. He collapsed, clutching Fluke tightly in his arms. The pole slipped from his grasp as he hit the dirt. The baby dragon flapped toward his guardian. He now perceived him as a benevolent being. The hatchling inched closer, then inhaled deeply and cried out the name T-Bone at the top of his lungs, unleashing a torrent of glacial wind. It clashed directly with the approaching razor storm. Kratos sensed the violent wind current diminish. He concluded the young dragon had utilized its cryogenic breath to disrupt the upward drafts fueling the vortex. Meanwhile, the tiny creature continued its effort. Despite its small frame, the dragon released a remarkably potent blast of frigid air. At that moment, Kratos resigned himself to his fate, understanding that such a feat might be overwhelming for a hatchling. The shredding wind loomed ever nearer. But then salvation arrived. 3 demons raced to their aid. Fluke's father lifted Kratos, Zephyros swept up Fluke, and Baal carried Azurat. Alongside the infant dragon, they fled from the deadly storm, exerting every ounce of speed and strength they possessed. Later on, Kratos was resting on his bed. 2 commanders approached him, both wearing sinister expressions. Hartok remarked that at last the demon overlord had drifted off, and that he would finally sever his head. Sergi concurred and mentioned that once they dealt with the remaining 2 fools, one of them would rise as the new demon monarch. They both pledged to remain partners until that moment. They pushed open the door and stepped into the chamber, immediately advancing toward the bed, ready to unleash their assaults. However, they froze midway, noticing something odd as the demon overlord had his eyes wide open with a chilling stare. They stood frozen, feeling as if they had been anticipated, yet chose to push forward since it might be their only shot. Just then, Baal and Azurat entered the chamber, questioning what the 2 thought they were attempting. The towering figure warned that the demon overlord was resting peacefully and that they shouldn't interrupt him. He also added about the expression Kratos made while dozing off, creepy enough to deserve the title of demon overlord even in slumber. With that, he stressed that if they dared disturb their master's rest, they would deeply regret it. The one wearing the monocle admitted he understood the muscle-bound brute's point, but questioned whether Azurat was in the same boat, considering siding with a demon overlord obsessed with agriculture. Azurat answered that he wasn't particularly thrilled about it, but owed his life to Kratos, and thus was merely repaying that debt. Hartok then asked if he hadn't realized yet that this entire potato farming scheme was only causing chaos, certain that beyond failing, it would drive them all into famine. So he wished to know if that didn't bother him. Without delay, Azurat responded that things were simply like that, and recalled young Flute toiling so earnestly despite her age. For that reason he stated if they wished to survive, they had to be willing to risk their lives. Even though he preferred risking it in combat as that was simply his nature. The one with the monocle firmly declared they would regret that decision, then exited the room with Sergi. At that instant, the commanders heard a noise from the chamber and saw that the demon overlord had awakened. Kratos, bewildered, called out Azurat's name, and the general questioned whether he might have overheard their entire discussion, though he quickly clarified he wasn't supporting him or anything similar. He insisted that he was merely repaying what he owed or something along those lines. Nonetheless, Kratos, with a menacing glare, demanded to know what on earth the lightning rod was doing walking around. Azurat, puzzled, had no time to react before receiving a bloody strike so intense it was visible from outside the fortress. They left the room, with Bahal carrying the battered Azurat on his back. And the demon overlord stated that they couldn't waste any more time and urged to gather everyone to resume clearing the lands. The general then mentioned that in truth, the stones had already vanished and that Zephyros had taken care of it. He appeared puzzled upon hearing that, until he noticed his subordinate giving orders to the farming squads. Observing this, he moved closer and questioned the patrol about what had been done with all the stones. Zephyros gestured toward a certain direction, stating he was with a particular creature. From a distance, Kratos glanced over and asked if it was T-Bone. The young dragon carried as many stones as possible in his mouth and flew back repeatedly to fetch more. He figured he couldn't shield his father from the slicing wind since he was still too small. But he was determined to eat plenty so he could grow swiftly. While soaring, he realized his father was calling him and immediately changed course toward him, which made Kratos thrilled to see his child even while wearing a fearsome expression. He contemplated that the slicing winds didn't occur frequently, and that if his baby dragon kept watching the sky and released the icy breath at just the right moment, they might manage to block the hurricane, but he considered there was no alternative, since avoiding this would lead to an even bigger problem. Then Zephyros mentioned that the Chunho supply was running low and asked whether they should prepare more. Kratos answered that it wasn't necessary and pondered that the first challenge of farming was natural disasters, and the second was cost, hurdles they would need to conquer. Meanwhile, inside the fortress, Sergi rested in her chamber until she removed her helmet. She, a stunning blonde, shook out her hair and remarked that the stench of manure still clung to her even after so many days without stepping into the fields. At that instant, Kratos called at her door, saying they needed to discuss something. She found it odd, since the demon overlord had never come to her room before. So she questioned what he wanted, claiming they had nothing to discuss. He stated he truly needed her assistance and asked her to please open the door. She became enraged and ordered him to leave, but he insisted, warning her that he would enter. Sergi spun around, shouting that there was no reason for them to talk, until she saw Kratos nearly naked crossing the doorway and became frantic at the sight. She then demanded to know if he was insane for entering a woman's room like that. Immediately, he dropped to a crouch, prompting her to ask what on earth he was doing. Kratos explained that without her, he was helpless. She didn't understand and blushed furiously. Kratos reflected that in order to cut costs, he was even prepared to kneel since he urgently needed her sharp blade at that moment. Sergi, still flustered, said that if he needed it so desperately, she was willing to hear him out. He quickly noticed her reaction and couldn't believe she had suddenly changed her demeanor. They proceeded to the storage area and stood before the potatoes. Kratos requested her to slice the potatoes since they needed to be halved for planting. Upon hearing this, she flew into a rage, feeling completely deceived. While cursing the demon overlord with every possible insult, he attempted to clarify that the task was simple, and that she shouldn't cut potatoes with 3 or fewer sprouts, but if there were 4, then she could proceed. He stressed that she must keep in mind the number of sprouts on each side of the slice, since they needed to be evenly divided. After sharing the instructions, he held the potatoes and declared he would toss them. But Sergi firmly stated she never agreed to do that. Nevertheless, he threw them anyway and without time to react. She braced herself and, using remarkable skill, sliced all the potatoes perfectly in half, cutting with extreme accuracy that even left Kratos astonished. He began inspecting them one by one and questioned how she managed to slice so precisely. Turning toward her, he praised her once more, saying he had always known she was the only one capable of it. She thought about that half-hearted flattery and became wary, knowing she wouldn't fall for his sweet talk again, calling him a deceitful trickster. Instantly, he stood up with an intimidating aura and stepped closer to her. Then he grabbed a cloth and wiped his blade until it gleamed. The general felt flustered and asked what he was doing. He answered that potato juice had splashed on it and it needed to be cleaned. She, burning with embarrassment, wondered if he had lost his mind, unable to comprehend why he was acting this way. Besides that look in his eyes, sincere, warm, and intense. Kratos noticed the sword was now spotless and admitted that it felt satisfying, imagining that if the blade wasn't thoroughly cleaned, infections could spread to the potatoes. So it had to be washed meticulously. He approached her again and with a captivating gaze, asked her to please lend a hand, insisting she was the only one who could accomplish it. Inside, he thought she was the sole demon capable of cutting potatoes while also helping to store the chunos. Sergi, still blushing, took a deep breath and agreed to assist this time. Inwardly, she called the demon lord foolish. He rejoiced at her response and said he would fetch hot water and towels so they could spend the entire night cutting together. She simply couldn't understand why the demon lord was so thrilled, once again calling him silly. After that, they continued slicing all the potatoes, while Hartok watched from afar, seeing the two working in total harmony as they cut. He fumed at the sight, thinking Sergi had also become one of the pitiful fools, volunteering to serve the demon lord simply because she received a few compliments. Meanwhile, beneath the scorching sun, Azurat was still tied to the cross, contemplating what it meant to truly live and wondering what purpose a lightning rod had to keep existing since such a harsh life seemed worthless. Then Flute approached and mentioned that the elders had saved chunos for him, and asked if he wanted to play the game of tossing them. He called her a brat and asked if she truly believed that a great general like him would ever play a game with a low-ranking demon, warning that he would devour her alive if she dared come closer. Regardless, she tosses the food, but it lands directly in his mouth. This infuriates him so much that he demands to know if she doesn't understand how to throw correctly, ordering her to do it properly. From a distance, the one with the monocle observes and concludes that Azurat has already lost his sanity, thinking he has taken so many blows that he can't think clearly anymore. Then he spins around after hearing someone yelling. It was Kratos announcing that they would finally begin planting the potatoes in the fields. Hartok watches the scene and decides that he never expected anything from him anyway. At that exact moment, the farming squad begins expressing gratitude to Sergi for slicing all the potatoes for them. She, slightly embarrassed, responds that she didn't cut them for their sake. The monocle wearer notices her reaction and questions what kind of expression that is, since it doesn't resemble the face of a great demon general. He also notices the lower-ranking demons weeping over the potato seeds, and questions whether they aren't ashamed of themselves. He concludes they are all fools and internally declares that the greatest mind among the demons will rise to take the demon lord's throne. Meanwhile, Kratos instructs them to keep planting since soon the sprouts will emerge and break through the ground. He further warns that when that happens they should start removing the extra sprouts. Bahal claims he's very skilled at cutting, but the demon lord orders him to stay quiet, and explains that each seed piece can produce 3 to 6 sprouts. Following this explanation, he poses the question of what is preferable, more or fewer sprouts. The demons answer that more would be better, but Kratos corrects them, stating that fewer is actually ideal. They appear bewildered and question why fewer is better, convinced the demon lord must be mistaken. Hartok, witnessing the conversation, becomes frustrated and calls everyone utter fools. Then he urges them to think for a moment because if there are too many sprouts, they will compete with each other for nutrients. In other words, the potato itself will end up with fewer nutrients. Kratos overhears from afar and admits his surprise, asking how Hartok knows that, and whether he has cultivated before. Hartok replies by questioning if they truly need to be taught something so fundamental, explaining that the sprouts and the potato share the same nutrients, which should be obvious. Kratos then asks how many sprouts would be ideal, and Hartok responds that 2 would be the obvious answer. But after thinking further, he concludes that practically speaking, they could assume 1 sprout is best. However, if that single sprout damages the potato's root, it might die. He also proposes that they could create fertile soil artificially, by adding manure and turning the earth to improve airflow. Everyone stands in awe at his explanation as he continues, stating that the soil group won't only benefit the potatoes but also weeds that compete for nutrients, which means those weeds will need to be eliminated. The demon lord simply cannot comprehend what he has just heard, and loudly demands that everyone applaud since they have a true genius in their ranks. All the demons begin shouting, "Genius, genius, genius," and Hartok becomes agitated hearing it as they don't stop praising him for even a moment. For a brief instant, he recalls how his mother always called him foolish, and turns around, overcome with emotion, trying to hide that he is tearing up, not fully understanding why he feels that way. Then Kratos steps forward and calls him wise, declaring that from now on, he will appoint him to lead the farmer troops as their commander. Hartok internally thinks this is absurd since his intellect exists to conquer and annihilate other species. However, Kratos yells, asking what everyone is standing around for, insisting they show respect to the supreme elite of the demon kind. All at once, they begin shouting that the general is the elite among elites, And Hartok, seething inside, considers everyone beneath him. But with authority, he orders them to follow him from this moment onward, imagining he will command only briefly since those in front of him continues celebrating endlessly about the new leadership. At that point, a system notification appears stating that Kratos has won the psychological battle. He feels confused by this since he has no idea what it refers to. Another notice informs him that he recognized Bahal's neglected childhood and transformed him into a loyal subordinate. He questions internally if he really did this unconsciously. There's also a notification mentioning that Azurat, who had never had a friend, has gained a new companion and thus lessened his violent nature. Kratos doesn't quite understand which friend it's referring to. Meanwhile, Sergi's heart softened. She was a woman who had never experienced love. He also established trust in Hartok, who merely desired acknowledgement. Because of these developments, he now has access to a new skill by using 200 happiness points, and the skill revealed is blood vision. He feels shocked because this ability wasn't in the game at all, and is probably original, just like the Farmer's Throne skill. The system explains that this ability allows him to glimpse the near future of his target, currently up to 6 hours ahead. It also specifies that the target can be a living being or an object. But his surprise intensifies immediately after. A new notification says it can even be used on the sky. This revelation excites him immensely since it's essentially a weather forecast. Meanwhile, somewhere between the forsaken lands of the demons and the human territories, specifically in the village of exiles, a man arrives announcing that he has completely recovered. His subordinate greets him warmly, expressing relief to see him well again. Rivage thanks him for all the support and admits he wishes he could be reborn with a sturdier body next time. Diol chuckles and responds that he'd rather be rich like a noble so he could boss people around. Rivage laughs at that and turns to Kim Chi, telling him they plan to return to the kingdom and asks if he wants to join them. With a serious look, Kim Chi replies that he's unsure, since, as he mentioned before, he doesn't remember his true identity and hasn't lived among humans. Because when he first arrived in that village, the inhabitants didn't exactly welcome him warmly. For that reason he wonders if someone like him would truly be accepted anywhere. The two observe quietly for a moment until Rivage proposes that perhaps he should start by wearing different attire. However, this doesn't happen when Diol teasingly asks if the hero really doesn't want to take off those strange clothes. The messenger concludes that Kim Chi must truly be fond of them. Yet, in his mind, the hero admits that he actually wants to change clothes. But he cannot figure out why they simply won't come off, as if they are fused to his body. Rivage thanks one of the villagers for their hospitality and remarks that living there solely because one is a descendant of an exile is extremely harsh. He adds that when he returns to the kingdom, he will inform the king about this situation. Kim Chi watches this exchange and imagines that Rivage is a nobleman sent to explore the territories near the demons under royal orders. And he is indeed not an arrogant person but rather kind and worthy of respect. This reflection makes him ponder who he himself used to be and concludes that all he remembers is following orders and eliminating others repeatedly. Thinking about this causes him to lower his head, as he wonders if he is even capable of doing anything besides taking lives. Back in the demon realm, the farming squad starts to notice the sprouts emerging and cheers excitedly since they are finally appearing. The generals approach to witness it too, realizing that the plants are truly growing. Flute rushes over to Azurat to share the exciting news. He erupts in anger upon hearing it and demands to know what he's supposed to do with that information. Then, the Kratos calls for the agricultural division and announces that the next phase will be burying, asking the wise Hartok to elaborate further. Hartok explains that burying means covering the sprout stems with earth to prevent the young potatoes from being exposed to sunlight, because if that happens they will change color, lose flavor, and even become toxic, thus becoming what are called spoiled potatoes. Kratos requests applause since the explanation was so insightful, which leaves the general slightly embarrassed. He then gazes upward to examine the weather that day and reflects that he ended up spending 200 happiness points on the weather prediction ability, and his blood vision skill has already evolved, with the activation condition requiring him to stare for 200 seconds without blinking. However, he starts making an expression like a stray dog since his eyes begin burning and it becomes exhausting. The lower-ranking demons witness this and believe that the Demon King is shedding tears of joy because the sprouts have grown. After some time, the ability finally activates, revealing that for the next 6 hours, the weather is expected to stay mostly clear and dry, suggesting that it might be wise to put away the humidifier. Kratos finds this intriguing and tells T-Bone that he will be able to rest peacefully since there won't be that ridiculous windstorm. At that moment, Zephyrus approaches and mentions he has an urgent report to deliver, explaining that the subordinate of the second Star Master has returned. They then head back to the castle, and soon after LaFleur introduces himself, stating he received the message about pausing agricultural activities and reports that the third Star Master, Ruster, launched an assault on them, claiming that the demon lord had grown weak and that he should seize his position. The Kratos becomes irritated because he thinks all demons behave the same. Zephyrus remarks that this truly poses a problem because if the third Star Master defeats the second Star Master and they ally, it will not be easy to handle them. Kratos agrees and points out that although they are low in level, their numbers are overwhelmingly large. He contemplates that he must find a solution before the second Star Master collapses, even though he cannot neglect the agricultural tasks for too long. The region attacked by the third Star Master is a deep underground abyss known as the Swamp of Decay, which, when compared to the game map, is actually 10 times larger and absurdly distant. He heads to the opposite abandoned area, which should provide bonuses in the game and is located inside the Demon Lord's castle, but it isn't functioning. This makes him ponder how to resolve this and manage the farming at the same time. He pauses to think, not fully understanding why he is so concerned, and with a wicked grin, decides that since he is the Demon King, the boss doesn't have to do everything himself. So he sticks to his plan and Sergi makes a fuss, claiming she isn't fighting because of him. Bahal proudly announces he will follow orders no matter what. The Kratos concludes that he can dispatch 2 of his 4 generals to the battlefield, and along with some powerful demons, they can make a significant impact. He knows that in the boss's domain, the shortcut system is fully connected, including one that leads directly to the Swamp of Decay. Aware of this, he orders the long-range sprayer to be launched, believing that if he and Hartok fully concentrate on the fights, everything will succeed. The Second Kingdom is engulfed in flames and Planus, the second Star Master, is kneeling on the ground and confronts the enemy, demanding how he dares challenge the Demon King and commit treason. The demon approaches and declares that this is a revolt, saying he had no other choice. This is Ruster, the third Star Master. He claims that ending that war will only bring devastation to their race. Planus becomes even more infuriated and argues that the Demon King promised to provide fertile lands, so they no longer need to battle humans for sustenance. Ruster responds that this is not the issue, and with his weapon lifted, he states that fighting with bravery is the pride of their kind. Suddenly, a weapon flies toward them and strikes the Star Master's club directly, knocking it away. He turns to see what caused it and realizes it is 2 of the celestial generals. Sergi wastes no time and admits to Ruster that he is correct, as their race truly was born to battle. She says they adore fighting more than anything else but wonders how things ended up like this and why they even started enjoying it in the first place, but she finally understands after observing everything that happened lately. Flute runs with a bright smile on her face. She bursts through her house door, shouting and calling her father to hurry to the fields. Once they return to the field, they are amazed to see the beautiful crops that have grown. Witnessing this brings tears to the lower demons and even Azurat, who also weeps because of it. Hartok and Zephyros watch from afar, as does Kratos, standing proudly before his grand accomplishment. The little girl runs, calling for the Demon King, and Happy says that it is truly beautiful and that she has never seen anything like it before. Kratos simply remains quiet. Back with Sergi, she charges fiercely at the demonic master and attacks with her countless swords. The opponent, distracted, fails to notice the tyrant closing in and gets grabbed. She seizes the chance and unleashes an endless barrage of strikes while her target is restrained. Ruster starts begging her to stop and insists he never mentioned finishing anyone off, claiming he was there to save lives and doesn't understand what they are doing. She reflects that this might be true, but she doesn't stop attacking, declaring that sometimes one must be eliminated to protect many others. He becomes enraged hearing this since it makes no sense to him. Meanwhile, Kratos, in front of Flute, remarks that finally they started to sprout and that there were many at once, then orders the useless flowers to be cut immediately. The demons are upset about this, and Azurat starts yelling, declaring he will never forgive the Demon King for being so heartless. Hartok enjoys hearing this since even in that situation, the king stayed true to his nature. Because of that, he asks what everyone is waiting for since they must carry out the order at once. Dirok, though upset, kneels in front of the flower and sees it looking sad. Another demon laments, saying he cannot do it because they put in so much effort to make them grow and had never seen anything so beautiful on that land. The general, with little patience, warns that if they leave the flowers there, they will consume all the nutrients instead of the potatoes doing so, and the priority is to make the potatoes grow large and well-fed, not create a flower bed. The farming troops then comply even though it pains them deeply. Kratos watches this with excitement since he enjoyed hearing the word potato echo in his mind. After that, the generals return and report that they have captured Ruster. The Demon King makes it clear that this is the consequence for sparking a rebellion and that everything he built was destroyed by another, and he will do something about it. The Star Master simply asks to finish him already since a demon who lost his honor in combat deserves nothing but death. Without delay, Kratos uses his ability to fry the demonic master, but he laughs as he didn't even feel a tickle because he wears excellent armor. Kratos questions if that really happened and if he didn't take any damage at all. Then he drags him to the plantation and uses a lightning rod, explaining that he actually found the task quite useful. Then he uses his ability again, making Ruster scream in agony and also beg to be finished already, and since now they have a new lightning rod. The Demon King requests someone to take Azurat off the cross since he isn't recovering well and it's long overdue to retire him. They untie him and Flute runs toward him to help, but stops midway because his expression was terrifying. The general keeps muttering that the little demon girl humiliated him for too long and that's why he wants to devour her first. She freezes in shock upon seeing his ominous aura. However, his legs give out and he collapses face first to the ground. He curses it all since it has been ages since he last walked until Bahal approaches and lifts him into his arms, leaving Azurat inconsolable to the point of demanding what the hell he thinks he's doing since he's not a princess to be carried around like that. The big guy ties him to his back to carry him and says it was an order from the Demon Lord and that he'll stay like that for now. The Prince of Darkness is furious about it, swearing that he will never forget this humiliation. Meanwhile, Kratos watching from a distance admits that he was worried that Lunatic would snap again, but when he used his blood vision skill, he quickly knew the weather would stay the same for 6 hours and so he decided to release him. He points his finger and says that Harvest Day will come soon so they need to move faster. But deep down he's relaxed since he has a super fast wheat cutter that can eliminate the flowers instantly. He also has a professional transporter that makes everything much smoother. He reflects that, in a way, the autumn harvest isn't far off and the food supplies are steadily depleting, and even though demons are used to famine, he can't bear to see how exhausted they'll become. At that moment, someone approaches calling out to him. It was Planus, who introduces himself as the master of the second star and is there to express his gratitude for having been saved. Kratos stands quiet for a moment, and so does the Star Master. Then, he abruptly shifts his expression to rage, leaving Planus bewildered as to why he suddenly turned furious. All Kratos can think about is why that demon showed up empty-handed to offer thanks when he could have at least brought some wine or a few fruits. The Star Master mentions that he is currently gathering some of the third star subordinates and will soon put them to work. All the Demon King can think about is that the potatoes are thriving splendidly, and he wants to harvest them quickly to prepare chunos. He says that what he really wants is to watch the demons eat until they are completely satisfied. Only then does he pause to think about why he started doing this in the first place. While lost in his thoughts, the second Star Master announces that he will prepare the troops and then leaves the field. Kratos watches him depart and considers that this Star Master was among the weakest and least advanced, yet he liked the confidence he carried and his unwavering loyalty to the demon homeland. He also guesses that this demon is technically like a plant, so in the end he might turn out quite valuable. As Planus walks through the field, he feels under his feet that the earth is incredibly rich and brimming with nutrients unlike anything he had ever sensed before. After strolling for a while, he imagines that at first he was merely a sprout and therefore never grew properly using nutrients. But he finds that soil remarkably different because it was nurtured by Lord Kratos. He uses his power and begins to root himself into the mountain, concluding that he can become stronger in that ground to the extent of potentially rising to the level of Demon King. Thinking about this, his roots start spreading throughout the entire land.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, it really helps. And for more content like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see another part. I'd love to hear your thoughts. See you next time. Bye-bye.